Hey there. Welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're heading back into the wild chaos of the cocaine boom. This is the story of a man who thought he could build an empire on an island. And for a time, he actually did. His name was Carlos Lehder. Some call him a visionary. Others, a madman. But the world would remember him as the cocaine cowboy who turned Norman's Cay, a quiet Bahamian paradise, into the beating heart of a billion-dollar drug pipeline. From small-time hustler to Medellin cartel kingpin, from reckless dreamer to international fugitive, this is the rise and fall of the man who flew too close to the sun. But before we dive in, let me ask you, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it where you are? It's always crazy to me seeing this little outlaw family stretch across time zones and continents. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what's next. We've got a long road of shadows ahead, and trust me, you'll want to stick around for every step. So settle in, let the world quiet down for a while, and follow me into the underworld. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. The story of Carlos Lehder does not begin with planes loaded with cocaine roaring across the Caribbean skies. It begins much smaller, with a boy in the mountains of Colombia, restless and wide-eyed, staring at the world as if it were already his to take. The irony is that from the very start, people around him could sense he was different. Too curious, too sharp, too willing to bend the truth until it broke. What no one could predict was how far that restlessness would eventually reach, and how much blood and fortune it would spill across nations. Picture the small city of Armenia in the 1940s. It is nestled in the heart of Colombia's coffee region, a place of rolling green hills, mule caravans, and narrow streets packed with vendors shouting over one another. The smell of roasted beans and dust fills the air. Families survive on tradition and discipline. Yet underneath this rustic calm, the country itself is tearing apart. Civil conflict, known simply as la violencia, is spreading like a sickness, killing thousands, leaving entire towns scarred. For a child growing up here, violence is not an abstraction. It is part of the rhythm of daily life, like rainstorms or church bells. Into this world, Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born. His father, a German mechanic who had fled the ruins of Europe, carried the weight of discipline and pride. His mother, Colombian, carried warmth, resilience, and the improvisational instinct of survival. Around the family's table, two worlds collided. German rigidity on one side, Colombian adaptability on the other. And in the middle sat Carlos, absorbing both, quietly calculating what they could mean for him. From his father, he took the idea that strength and order could command respect. From his mother, he learned charm, the kind that could disarm suspicion or soften a blow. Combined, they gave him an edge no ordinary child carried. But edges cut both ways. Teachers noticed early that Carlos had an intelligence sharper than most. He grasped lessons quickly, but his attention drifted. He challenged authority, mocked discipline, and turned punishments into performances that left classmates laughing. What others saw as arrogance, he saw as proof. If he could outwit the adults meant to control him, then why should he ever obey them? A dangerous seed was planted. Rules were not boundaries to follow, but obstacles to conquer. In those years, Colombia was a nation where survival often outweighed morality. Armed men patrolled rural roads. Political murders happened in broad daylight. The air buzzed with fear and uncertainty. For young Carlos, the lesson was blunt. Respect did not belong to the obedient. It belonged to the bold. He watched older boys swagger through the streets, their pockets heavy with gambling money or stolen goods, and he wanted that power for himself. He didn't want to wait for permission to taste life. He wanted to seize it. By his teenage years, Carlos had already begun to test the limits. First came the small thefts. Fruit from market stalls, cigarettes from distracted vendors, coins lifted from pockets. To outsiders, these were childish pranks. To Carlos, they were training exercises. Each theft was a game, a puzzle, a way to prove he could beat the system. Soon the crimes grew larger. Stolen bicycles, strip cars, quick hustles that brought easy cash. Where other boys looked for safe thrills, Carlos looked for leverage. If you stole a car, you could sell the parts. If you lied convincingly, you could turn debt into profit. His mind bent naturally toward schemes. And still, people found him magnetic. He was reckless, yes, but also funny, quick-witted, impossible to ignore. Neighbors whispered about him. Some called him brilliant. Others warned he was dangerous. Both were right. His family tried discipline, then pleading, then resignation. His father demanded order. His mother prayed for guidance. But Carlos brushed them off with a grin that said he was untouchable. Deep down, he believed it. He was the son of two cultures, the boy who didn't fit into any single box, and he carried that difference like armor. America drifted into his imagination like a beacon. Rock and roll, Hollywood films, glossy magazines filled with fast cars and glamorous stars. All of it flooded Colombia in the 1960s. For most kids, they were fantasies. For Carlos, they were roadmaps. If James Dean could rebel on screen, he would rebel in real life. If Elvis could make women scream, he would make the world take notice. He wanted to live louder, faster, and higher than anyone around him. Armenia felt too small, Colombia too slow. His eyes were already fixed on bigger horizons. Yet even as he dreamed, Colombia's violence tightened around him. La Violencia had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Entire communities carried scars. In the streets, Carlos saw how quickly a man could rise or fall, depending on how ruthless he was willing to be. The lesson hardened in his mind. Fear was currency, and he intended to be rich. Still a teenager, he was already feared by local police, watched by neighbors, admired by kids who wanted to be like him. Power, even in small doses, intoxicated him. But ambition is a dangerous hunger. Petty crimes were no longer enough. Armenia was too provincial, too easy. Carlos wanted scale. He wanted the kind of schemes that would stretch across borders. He wanted America. To him, the United States wasn't a country. It was a stage, glittering and vast, where the bold could become legends. And he was ready to gamble everything to reach it. By the late 1960s, whispers of his exploits were already circulating. He wasn't just another thief. He thought bigger. He treated stolen cars as if they were merchandise in a store, organized, resold, and turned into capital. He built contacts, learned who could be bribed, who could be tricked, and who needed to be feared. He was learning the foundations of empire in miniature, long before cocaine became his obsession. His dual heritage gave him confidence. With his lighter German features, he could pass for a foreigner in Colombia, even for an American. That small difference made him feel larger than life. He believed he was destined for more than the ordinary struggles of his neighbors. He wasn't just Colombian. He wasn't just German. He was both, and that, in his mind, made him untouchable. But untouchable men often tempt fate. His hunger for America eventually carried him north. What he found was not glamour, but cold steel bars. Arrested in the United States for car theft, he was thrown into prison. To most men, it would have been a setback, humiliation, even ruin. To Carlos, it was none of those things. It was opportunity. If the streets of Armenia had been his training ground, this was the university. Behind those walls, he met men who knew smuggling routes, who understood drug markets, who could turn contacts into fortunes. Prison became his classroom. Every whispered scheme was a lecture. Every hardened criminal was a mentor. But that part of his story belongs to the next chapter. For now, the image is this: a young man who grew up in the turbulence of Colombia, shaped by two cultures, driven by rebellion, already notorious in his hometown, now staring at a cell door in a foreign land. And instead of fear, his lips curve into a smile. He doesn't see punishment. He sees preparation. The boy who once stole cigarettes and cars is about to discover a product far more profitable, far more addictive, and far more deadly. The kind of product that could turn him into a king or a ghost. The door slams shut. The sound echoes through the concrete hall. Somewhere, a guard mutters that this one will not last long, that prison will break him like it breaks so many others. But Carlos is already planning, already scheming, already imagining the wings of a small plane cutting across the ocean, heavy with powder that will change the world. He cannot yet know the cost. He cannot yet see the island fortress he will one day command. All he knows is that rules were meant to be broken, and his story has only just begun. The sound of engines echoed through the streets of Queens at night, steel and rubber grinding against pavement, headlights cutting through the darkness. A car peeled away from the curb, but it didn't belong to the driver. It belonged to whoever was unlucky enough to park it in New York without realizing a young Colombian hustler had been watching. Inside that stolen vehicle, gripping the wheel with a grin that bordered on defiance, was Carlos Lehder. He wasn't just taking cars. He was taking chances, and every chance felt like a step towards something bigger. The leap from Armenia, Colombia, to New York City was not simply a change of scenery. It was like being dropped into the bloodstream of ambition itself. For Carlos, America was loud, fast, and ruthless, the kind of place where if you didn't take what you wanted, someone else would. He came chasing opportunity, but opportunity wasn't waiting with open arms. It was hiding in back alleys, locked inside parked cars, tucked into smuggling routes whispered about in dimly lit bars. And Carlos was determined to find it. In Colombia, his crimes had been petty distractions. In New York, they became survival. At first, it was theft, small jobs, easy money. But in a city swollen with immigrants, hustlers, and dreamers, Carlos found himself drawn to the shadows where ambition turned into crime. Car theft became his specialty. New York in the 1960s was a playground for a man like him. The streets were filled with American muscle cars and flashy imports, symbols of wealth parked like bait. Carlos studied them with the patience of a hunter. A broken lock here, a hot-wired ignition there. In minutes, the cars were his. Some were stripped for parts, others driven across state lines. To most, it was crime. To him, it was business. He wasn't stealing cars, he was running inventory. But what made him stand out wasn't just speed or skill. It was vision. He saw cars not as joyrides, but as stepping stones. A stolen vehicle could become quick cash, and quick cash opened doors to bigger schemes. He built contacts in junkyards, garages, and underground markets. With every deal, his reputation grew. He was no longer just a young immigrant trying to find his footing. He was carving his name into the city's underworld. Still, New York was a place that tested every weakness. Behind the neon lights and towering buildings, there was a cruel rhythm. Take or be taken. For a man like Carlos, who thrived on risk, the temptation to go further was constant. Petty theft wasn't enough. He wanted scale. He wanted power. And in the late 60s, whispers of cocaine were beginning to circle the city like rumors of a storm. Marijuana had its place, heroin had its market, but cocaine was something else. It was exotic, expensive, and seductive. To the rich, it was a symbol of status. To the hustlers, it was the future. Carlos wasn't fully in the game yet. But even at this stage, the seeds were being planted. He watched, he listened, he learned. In nightclubs, he saw the way cocaine moved. Discreet packets exchanged with a handshake. Wide-eyed buyers ready to pay fortunes for a high that promised energy and confidence. He studied the way he once studied parked cars. Not as a thrill, but as a system waiting to be exploited. But getting there required connections. And connections often came through the same place Carlos seemed destined to end up. Prison. His arrest for car theft was inevitable. The police had been watching, and eventually they caught him. The clink of handcuffs, the slam of a cell door. It could have been the end. But for Carlos, it was another kind of beginning. Prison wasn't punishment. It was an academy. Behind bars, he met men who had already crossed the line into serious smuggling. They weren't just talking about stolen cars or quick hustles. They were talking about flying cocaine from Colombia into Florida, about routes that stretched from Medellin to Miami, about fortunes made in white powder. For Carlos, it was like hearing the sound of destiny knocking. To understand the pull of cocaine in those years, you have to imagine America itself. The late 60s and early 70s were turbulent. The country was wrestling with war, rebellion, and cultural upheaval. Cocaine entered that chaos like a glamorous guest at a party. It wasn't seen as dangerous yet, not like heroin. It was clean, elite, almost respectable. The wealthy lined up for it, and the profits were staggering. Every gram smuggled into the U.S. could be sold for 10 times its value in Colombia. It was like turning dirt into diamonds. For a man like Carlos, who was already addicted to risk and reward, it was irresistible. In prison, he absorbed every lesson. He asked questions, memorized names, collected contacts the way a student collects books. Every whispered scheme became a note for his future empire. The irony was clear. The system meant to contain him was actually shaping him. He wasn't being broken down. He was being built up. And when he finally walked out of those gates, he wasn't the same reckless thief who had walked in. He was sharper, hungrier, more dangerous. He now had a vision larger than stolen cars. He had glimpsed the architecture of an empire. But vision alone wasn't enough. He needed capital. He needed routes. And most of all, he needed nerve. In New York, he tested each of those. He smuggled small amounts of drugs, tested the market, learned what buyers crave and how much they would pay. Every risk paid off in experience. Every close call hardened his resolve. For most, the risk of prison would have been a deterrent. For Carlos, it was simply the cost of doing business. What set him apart was not just ambition, but audacity. He didn't just want to be another smuggler in New York. He wanted to rewrite the game. He studied aviation, fascinated by the idea that a single plane could move more cocaine in hours than street hustlers could sell in weeks. He dreamed of airstrips, secret islands, and fleets of planes carrying fortunes across the Caribbean. At this stage, it was still fantasy. But every fantasy has a starting point, and for Carlos, it was in these years, stealing cars, smuggling small loads, and imagining something bigger. The immigrant struggle fueled him too. In New York, he saw wealth everywhere, but most immigrants were shut out, scraping by in factories or service jobs. Carlos refused that fate. To him, the American dream wasn't about hard work. It was about shortcuts, about daring to take what others were too afraid to grab. If America was built on ambition, he would be the most ambitious of them all, even if it meant breaking every law written to stop him. But ambition is a fire that consumes. The more he tasted risk, the more he craved. Each successful hustle only made him hungry for the next. Friends and associates noticed the change. He was no longer content with small victories. He carried himself like a man already destined for greatness. The arrogance was magnetic, but also dangerous. The police noticed. Rivals noticed. And each step deeper into crime brought him closer to forces far larger and far deadlier than he could yet understand. There's a moment every outlaw faces when the line between petty crime and organized crime blurs. For Carlos, that moment came quietly, almost invisibly. A deal made in a nightclub. A package carried across state lines. A handshake with a man who claimed to have connections in Miami. Each act seemed small, but together they were building blocks of a larger empire. He was no longer just a thief. He was becoming a smuggler. And in the shadows of New York, where crime families and syndicates thrived, his name began to circulate. Yet with every rise comes a fall. And for Carlos, the fall came once again in the form of prison bars. Another arrest. Another sentence. Another cell door closing behind him. But just like before, he didn't see an ending. He saw an opening. Because this time, the men inside weren't just petty hustlers. They were traffickers with ties stretching back to Colombia, men who whispered about fortunes in Medellin, about an underworld that was just beginning to flex its power. For Carlos, prison wasn't a setback. It was the missing link, the place where his Colombian roots and his American ambitions fused into something combustible. And so the chapter closes not with triumph, but with anticipation. A young man, reckless and fearless, sits in a cell in the United States. He has stolen cars, smuggled drugs, and built connections that most men would kill for. But what truly matters is not what he has done, but what he has learned. He now knows that cocaine is the future, that planes are the vehicles of empires, that islands can become fortresses, and that one man, if bold enough, can bend nations to his will. Carlos Lehder isn't a kingpin yet, but the blueprint is already in his mind, sharp and dangerous as broken glass. The question isn't whether he will rise. It's how high, and how much blood it will cost. The cell door slammed shut, and in that echoing moment, a young man grinned as if he had been handed a key instead of a sentence. For most prisoners, jail was the end of the road. For Carlos Lehder, it was orientation day. He wasn't here to be punished. He was here to learn. And the walls of that prison would become his classroom, his library, his boardroom. This was where ambition sharpened into strategy, and where a car thief would begin to reinvent himself into something much larger. The first thing Carlos realized was that prison was not what the outside world imagined. To outsiders, it looked like a cage. But inside, it was an ecosystem, a society with its own laws, its own hierarchies, and its own markets. Men who had been stripped of everything still found ways to build networks. Cigarettes became currency. Favors became leverage. Secrets became weapons. To Carlos, this wasn't despair. It was a revelation. If rules could be bent here, in the belly of the beast, then rules could be bent anywhere. He began by listening. That was his gift, hidden beneath the cocky smile and restless energy. He could disarm a man by making him feel heard, and then pull from him whatever knowledge he carried. Some inmates bragged about smuggling heroin across state lines. Others whispered about Mexican border routes, hidden airstrips, corrupt officials. To most ears, it was noise. To Carlos, it was music. Every story was a note. Every detail a piece of a larger symphony he was already composing in his head. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, he was still the same hot-headed thief, impatient and reckless. But prison had a way of teaching patience. You couldn't force time to move. You couldn't fight the system head-on. You had to adapt, to learn its rhythms, to play by its rules until you were strong enough to rewrite them. And Carlos was a quick learner. Slowly, his arrogance sharpened into calculation. He was no longer just chasing adrenaline. He was chasing structure. It was here that he first heard about the cocaine boom in earnest. Not just whispers, but blueprints. Men spoke of Medellin, where labs in the mountains were turning coca leaves into white powder that could fetch fortunes in the United States. They spoke of Miami, a city hungry for cocaine, where nightclubs and beaches masked the flow of millions in cash. They spoke of planes, faster and safer than boats, that could hop from Colombia to the Bahamas to Florida in hours. It was a global chessboard, and the players were getting richer by the day. For Carlos, it was intoxicating. He had always thought bigger than the streets of Armenia, bigger than the stolen cars of New York. But this was empire. Cocaine wasn't just a drug. It was a currency, more valuable than gold, lighter than any other commodity, and easier to hide. A kilo could be tucked into luggage, flown across borders, sold for 10 times its cost. To him, it was like alchemy. Turn leaves into powder, powder into fortune, fortune into power. And unlike heroin, which carried a stigma, cocaine was being marketed as glamorous, sophisticated, even clean. He knew instantly. This was the future. The men around him didn't see him as a student. They saw him as a partner. His Colombian roots gave him credibility, a passport into the supply side of the business. His German features and American confidence made him stand out, someone who could blend into multiple worlds. In a prison yard filled with desperate men, he looked like a bridge between them and the riches they could only dream of. And Carlos, ever the opportunist, leaned into that role. He promised ideas, contacts, loyalty. But in truth, he was gathering pieces for himself. Prison changed him in another way, too. It taught him the power of organization. In Armenia, his schemes had been small and chaotic. Here, he saw how real criminals thought. They didn't just steal. They managed. They built hierarchies. They controlled supply chains. They bribed officials, laundered money, silenced enemies. Crime wasn't anarchy. It was business, brutal, efficient business. And Carlos wanted to master it. Nights in the cell became strategy sessions. He would lie awake, replaying conversations, imagining air routes, calculating profits. A single kilo bought in Colombia for a few thousand could sell in Miami for tens of thousands. Multiply that by hundreds, then thousands, and you had numbers that defied imagination. But numbers alone weren't enough. He needed infrastructure. Planes, pilots, islands, safe houses. He didn't have them yet, but he knew where to look once he was free. The irony of prison was that the very system meant to cage him was grooming him for his future empire. Guards could lock doors, but they couldn't stop ideas from spreading in whispers across the yard. Carlos walked the halls not as a man defeated, but as a man preparing. Every handshake was a potential alliance. Every smirk hid a calculation. Every punishment was another lesson in how far rules could be bent before they snapped. And yet, even as he grew sharper, darker, there were moments of vulnerability. Nights when he thought of his mother in Armenia, praying for his redemption. Days when he remembered the stern face of his father, who had believed discipline could shape him. There was a part of Carlos that knew he could have chosen another path. But regret was a luxury he didn't allow himself. Regret was weakness, and weakness had no place in the empire he imagined. As his sentence dragged on, Carlos built a reputation. Some saw him as magnetic, others as manipulative. Both were true. He had a way of making men believe he cared about their stories, even as he was dissecting them for pieces of information. He laughed easily, spoke boldly, carried himself like someone who knew the future was already his. In the gray monotony of prison life, that confidence was electric. Men were drawn to him, even as they sensed the danger in his ambition. The moment of release finally came, and when the gates opened, Carlos didn't walk out broken. He walked out armed, not with weapons, but with knowledge. He carried a Rolodex of names, a blueprint of smuggling routes, a vision of how cocaine could be moved on a scale the world had never seen. He had entered prison as a car thief. He left as a strategist. The transformation was complete, but freedom came with urgency. The cocaine boom was accelerating, and Carlos knew opportunity wouldn't wait. Rivals were already making fortunes, carving up routes, building alliances. He couldn't afford hesitation. He needed to act, to take the scraps of knowledge he had gathered and turn them into something concrete. He began reaching out to contacts, testing small shipments, dipping his hands into the powder that would define his life. Every risk felt like validation. Every dollar earned was proof he had chosen correctly. Still, prison had left him with more than knowledge. It had left him with hunger. Hunger to build, to dominate, to prove he was greater than the petty hustlers who had mocked him in Armenia, greater than the police who had locked him away in New York. He didn't just want to join the cocaine trade. He wanted to own it. And that hunger was dangerous because it made him reckless, willing to push boundaries others feared. He began to dream of something radical, a base of operations outside U.S. reach, a place where planes could land safely, reload, and take off again. Not just a smuggling route, but a fortress, an island. The idea was still half-formed, but it gnawed at him. Why settle for scraps in New York when he could build a kingdom in the Caribbean? And so the chapter closes on a man transformed. Carlos Lehder, once a petty thief, now a visionary outlaw, stands on the threshold of something vast. Behind him lies the cage that shaped him. Ahead lies the empire he intends to build. The question is no longer whether he will rise, but how high he will climb before gravity, or bullets, drag him back down. The night after his release, he stared at the sky as a plane roared overhead. Its lights cut through the darkness, a reminder of the future he was chasing. In his mind, he could already see the cargo, the routes, the riches. The prison doors had closed behind him, but the world was opening wide. And somewhere, in the shadows of the Caribbean, an island was waiting to be transformed. The package was small enough to fit inside a shoebox. Wrapped tight, taped at the seams, it looked almost harmless. But inside was the powder that would change the world. Cocaine. White, fine, and almost weightless. Carlos Lehder held it in his hands for the first time and felt something stir deep inside him. Not fear, not hesitation, excitement. He didn't just see a drug. He saw possibility. That one package, barely a kilo, was worth more than anything he had ever stolen, stripped, or smuggled. And in that moment, he knew his future wasn't in cars or small hustles anymore. It was in powder. The late 1960s and early 70s were the birth of something that would reshape the criminal underworld. Cocaine was still new to America. It was exotic, almost glamorous, whispered about in nightclubs and backrooms as the drug of the rich and untouchable. It wasn't yet painted with the same fear and destruction as heroin. Cocaine was marketed by users themselves as clean, elegant, even safe. For a hustler like Carlos, it was like being shown a golden ticket, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. He started small. Everyone did. A kilo here, a few ounces there. Smuggled across borders and luggage, hidden inside car panels, or tucked under clothes. Each run was a test. Of nerve, of logistics, of luck. For Carlos, it was also education. He was learning the rhythms of a new market. How to source in Colombia. How to move through customs. How to sell in New York. Every step carried risk, but every step also paid far more than anything he had touched before. The numbers were staggering. A kilo of cocaine in Colombia might cost a few $1,000s. The same kilo in Miami or New York could sell for 10 times that amount. In some circles, 20 times. It was a profit margin so obscene it felt unreal, like a magician pulling endless coins from thin air. Carlos didn't need anyone to explain the appeal. He could do the math in his head. If stolen cars were pennies, cocaine was diamonds. Why chase scraps when you could chase empires? And yet, cocaine was not just money. It was status. In those days, celebrities, musicians, Wall Street brokers, they all flirted with it. It moved through elite circles with the same glamour as champagne and limousines. That glamour trickled down to the streets, where users craved not just the high but the image it gave them. Dealers knew it. Smugglers knew it. And now, Carlos knew it too. He wasn't just selling drugs. He was selling a dream. But dreams came with danger. Moving cocaine wasn't like stealing a car. A car theft might get you a slap from the police. Cocaine trafficking brought the full weight of law enforcement. Customs agents were learning to sniff out smugglers. Dogs were trained to detect the powder. And prisons were filling with men who had tried and failed. Every smuggling run was a gamble with freedom. But Carlos was wired for risk. To him, the danger wasn't deterrent. It was adrenaline. His first experiments were clumsy, improvised. Suitcases lined with false bottoms. Couriers paid to swallow pellets. Cars with hidden compartments. Each method carried its own peril. Couriers could panic. Suitcases could be searched. Hidden compartments could be discovered. But Carlos treated every failure as data, every close call as refinement. He was building a playbook. And with each success, he gained more confidence, more money, and more ambition. The difference between Carlos and so many others was how he thought about scale. Most smugglers were content with a few kilos at a time. Enough to live fast, to buy toys, to feel rich. Carlos wanted more. He wanted shipments, not suitcases. He wanted air routes, not bus stations. He wanted an empire, not a hustle. Even in these early days, he was dreaming of islands and runways, of operations so vast they would leave police chasing ghosts. But ambition requires partners. And in the underworld, partners were always a risk. Trusting the wrong man could end with a bullet or a prison cell. Still, Carlos couldn't do it alone. He reached out to Colombians already testing the cocaine trade, men who knew suppliers in Medellin and Cali. He offered charm, energy, and connections in America. Some saw him as reckless. Others saw him as valuable. Enough of them saw opportunity, and soon Carlos had his foot in the door. Back in Colombia, coca leaves were being grown in the mountains, processed in hidden labs in a cocaine paste, then refined into crystalline powder. It was still a cottage industry, rough around the edges, but it was growing fast. The demand in the United States was like a fire that couldn't be contained. And Carlos, with his dual heritage and his ambition, was perfectly positioned to carry buckets of gasoline to that fire. His German-Colombian identity made him adaptable. In Colombia, he spoke like a local. In the United States, He could pass as a foreign student, even as an eccentric European. Customs agents often overlooked him, distracted by stereotypes. He used it to his advantage, walking packages past guards who never suspected the charming young man with the light features and easy smile. Where others sweated and stumbled, Carlos breezed through. Money began to flow, and with it came confidence. He bought cars, clothes, luxuries that set him apart. For the first time, he wasn't just hustling for survival. He was building toward something. But the money also brought danger. Rivals noticed. Police noticed. And with every shipment, the stakes climbed higher. He was no longer just playing in the shadows. He was stepping into a storm. The lure of cocaine was not only in its profits, but in its speed. Cars, stolen or stripped, required effort and time. Cocaine moved fast. One sale could eclipse months of hustling. For Carlos, it was like tasting jet fuel. Once you've flown, walking feels unbearable. He couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. But success only made him hungrier. Each deal left him wanting more. Each shipment sparked visions of fleets of planes, warehouses stacked with kilos, empires stretching from Medellin to Miami. He spoke about the future with fire in his eyes, convincing others that he was destined to change the game. And some believed him. Enough to follow, to invest, to trust. Still, cocaine was a dangerous teacher. It taught him that greed could be blinding, that one mistake could unravel everything. And it taught him that the United States was not just a land of opportunity. It was a land of watchful eyes. Customs raids, drug busts, undercover agents. They were all sharpening their teeth as the cocaine trade grew. Carlos knew he had to stay ahead, to think bigger, to outsmart systems before they closed in. One night, after a successful run, he sat staring at the cash spread across a motel bed. The bills were piled high, crisp and intoxicating. But instead of satisfaction, he felt impatience. This was small, too small. The motel room was a cage, the cash just scraps. He wanted more. He needed a base of operations, a place no one could touch, where he could move cocaine not by the kilo, but by the ton. The idea of an island returned to him, sharper now, more urgent. Not just fantasy, but blueprint. Cocaine had given him a taste of power, but it had also shown him the limits of hustling in the shadows. If he wanted to rise, he had to create something untouchable, something permanent. And deep down, he knew he was only at the beginning. The packages he carried now were nothing compared to the cargo he dreamed of moving. The shoebox-sized kilo was just the seed. The forest was still waiting to grow. As the 70s opened wider, so did the trade. More Colombians entered the business. More routes were carved. More profits poured in. Carlos positioned himself at the edge of this boom, restless and ready. He had the ambition, the charm, and now, the experience. What he lacked was scale, and scale was what he was determined to find. The last image of this chapter is not of a triumphant kingpin. It is of a young man in a cheap motel room, staring at piles of cash and feeling it isn't enough. His eyes are already somewhere else, on the Caribbean, on airstrips, on empires not yet built. Cocaine had shown him the door. Now he intended to kick it wide open. The roar of a small engine cut through the Caribbean night. A Cessna, its paint chipped, its cabin overloaded, skimmed just above the waves like a predator hunting in silence. Inside, the cargo was not passengers or luggage, but bricks of cocaine wrapped in plastic. A fortune crammed into a space no bigger than a family car trunk. At the controls sat a pilot with sweat on his brow, eyes darting between the horizon and the fuel gauge, praying that the radar stay blind. In the shadows of that cockpit, Carlos Lehder's vision was taking flight, literally. He had grown restless with suitcases, with couriers swallowing pellets, with hiding kilos inside car panels. That was small time. And small time wasn't what he had come to America for. He wanted scale, and scale required the sky. A single small plane could carry more cocaine in hours than a dozen mules could in weeks. And more importantly, planes bypassed the choke points, the customs agents, the ports, the borders crawling with dogs. The air was freedom, if you were daring enough to take it. It began with experiments. He recruited pilots, some eager, some desperate, others simply reckless enough to take cash for risk. They were men who had flown crop dusters or short runs between islands, now being asked to carry packages that could put them in prison for life. Fear lingered in their eyes, but money silenced it. One successful run could make them more than a year of legal work. Carlos knew this. He used their hunger the way a general uses soldiers, promising rewards, ignoring the risks. The logistics were deceptively simple. A small plane could take off from a clandestine strip in Colombia, skim across the sea, and land in the Bahamas, sometimes even in fields or hidden clearings. From there, another hop carried the cargo into Florida. The whole journey could be done in a single night, with enough fuel and enough nerve. But the reality was never simple. Weather could shift in minutes. Engines could fail. Customs planes could appear on radar like wolves on the hunt. Every flight was a gamble with gravity and law. Carlos loved it. The danger, the innovation, the sense that he was rewriting the rules. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. He wasn't just smuggling drugs. He was building a system, networks of pilots, safe houses in the Bahamas, contacts in Miami who could receive shipments and move them quickly before suspicion rose. It was a puzzle, and he was assembling the pieces with a fanatic's focus. His charm became a weapon. He convinced pilots who would normally never touch crime to take a chance. He charmed mechanics into ignoring suspicious modifications on planes. He greased the palms of locals who allowed their fields to become impromptu landing strips. Everyone had a price, and Carlos was determined to pay it if it moved his vision forward. He wasn't stingy with his money, because he knew it was only bait. The real prize was control. Each successful run emboldened him. The cash flowed faster. The shipments grew larger. What began as a few kilos turned into dozens, then hundreds. At times, the planes were so packed that pilots feared the weight would pull them from the sky. But greed silenced fear. Every delivery to Miami was met with eager buyers, club owners, and street distributors who treated cocaine like liquid gold. The profits were astronomical. For every risk, there was a mountain of reward. Still, it wasn't only about money. For Carlos, it was about vision. He imagined a network of planes crisscrossing the Caribbean like invisible highways, a logistical empire that no one could stop. He studied maps with obsession, tracing flight paths, calculating distances, marking islands that could serve as stepping stones. He spoke of it like an architect describing a cathedral, with reverence, precision, and fire in his voice. To him, planes weren't just tools. They were wings of destiny. But networks require loyalty, and loyalty in the underworld is fragile. Pilots could be tempted to skim from shipments. Middlemen could betray him to rivals or law enforcement. Carlos countered this with a mix of generosity and intimidation. He paid well, making sure his men ate, drank, and lived better than they ever had. But he also made it clear that betrayal would not be forgiven. His reputation grew, not just as a smuggler, but as a man who demanded absolute control. He innovated too. One of his favorite tricks was scattering cocaine across small packages, hidden in unexpected places. If one shipment was seized, another would slip through unnoticed. He also experimented with using boats in tandem with planes, a method where cargo would be dropped at sea in waterproof containers, then retrieved by waiting vessels. It was redundancy, like a businessman diversifying investments. Every risk had a backup. Every plan had a contingency. The authorities, of course, began to notice. Customs agents saw unusual flight paths, small planes making frequent trips to the Bahamas and Florida. They tightened checks, increased patrols, deployed radar. But for every measure, Carlos devised a countermeasure. Flying low, just above the ocean waves, to avoid radar. Using night flights where moonlight was the only guide. Training pilots to cut engines and glide silently past certain checkpoints. It was a chess match, and Carlos thrived on it. For the pilots, the fear was constant. Every takeoff felt like a coin toss between fortune and ruin. They sweated through night skies, hearts pounding at every flicker on the radar, every sudden change in weather. Some prayed in silence, gripping crucifixes in their pockets. Others drowned fear in cocaine itself, flying high in more ways than one. Many hated the work, but none could turn down the money. Carlos knew this, and he pushed them harder. Back in Colombia, his name was beginning to spread. Not yet a kingpin, but no longer a petty thief either. He was the man experimenting with air smuggling, the man turning small planes into arteries of profit. Other traffickers noticed. Some admired him. Some envied him. A few plotted against him. But Carlos didn't care. He was already looking beyond Colombia, beyond the United States. He saw the entire Caribbean as his stage, every island a potential piece in his empire. And yet, for all his ambition, the network was fragile. Planes crashed. Pilots vanished. Shipments were lost at sea. Each failure cost money and trust. But Carlos refused to slow down. Setbacks only fueled his obsession. He believed the system could be perfected, that he could build something so efficient it would be unstoppable. To him, mistakes weren't defeats. They were experiments. And experiments always led to refinement. At times, even his closest associates wondered if he was driven by vision or madness. He spoke of owning islands, of building runways guarded by armed men, of creating a smuggling hub so secure that the United States could never touch him. It sounded impossible, fantastical, but in Carlos's eyes, it was already real. He carried himself not as a dreamer, but as a man who had already seen the future, and it terrified those around him. Every empire begins with an idea, and for Carlos, the idea was simple. The sky belonged to those bold enough to fly it. He wasn't content with scraps. He wanted the highways of the heavens. And with each plane that touched down safely, with each kilo that slipped past customs, with each dollar that piled up, his confidence grew into something unstoppable. The final image of this chapter is of a small plane landing on a makeshift strip in the Bahamas, its wheels kicking up dust as dawn broke over the horizon. The pilot, exhausted but alive, handed over the cargo. Carlos stood there, smiling, eyes already fixed on the future. To everyone else, it was a successful smuggling run. To him, it was proof of concept, proof that his dream of scale was not madness, but destiny. But destiny always comes at a price. And as the network expanded, so too did the risks. Law enforcement was closing in. Rivals were circling. Partners were growing restless. Carlos didn't care. He was already dreaming bigger. Bigger than planes. Bigger than shipments. Bigger than the Bahamas. Somewhere out there, an island was waiting. The sea shimmered like glass beneath the morning sun, calm and endless. On the horizon, a sliver of land appeared, a strip of sand, palms, and turquoise water that looked like paradise. To most men, Norman's Cay was just another Bahamian island, a speck among hundreds. But in the restless imagination of Carlos Lehder, it was destiny. He saw not beaches or tourists, but runways and fortresses. He saw planes landing under cover of night, their bellies heavy with cocaine. He saw warehouses, guns, and guards turning paradise into power. On that stretch of sand, he envisioned an empire. The idea had been gnawing at him for years. The smuggling runs were working, but they were fragile. Pilots sweated through nights, hiding in shadows, gambling against weather and radar. Every flight felt like rolling dice. Carlos didn't want dice. He wanted certainty, and certainty meant control. If he could carve out one place in the world where the rules belonged to him, he could move cocaine on a scale no one dared imagine. Norman's Cay became that place in his mind, the island that would change everything. It wasn't chosen at random. The Bahamas were already a smuggler's paradise. Hundreds of islands, some inhabited, most not, scattered like stepping stones between Colombia and Florida. They were close enough to the U.S. mainland for a short hop, but remote enough for secrecy. Norman's Cay, just 3 miles long, had what mattered most, an airstrip. It wasn't much, a strip of asphalt barely suited for small planes, but to Carlos, it was gold. With the right money, the right guns, the right intimidation, he could make it his. The plan was audacious. Buy up land, push out locals, bring in loyal men, and turn the island into a fortress disguised as paradise. He poured money into it like a man possessed. Villas were purchased. Hotels bought out. Locals offered cash, too tempting to refuse. And those who hesitated found themselves pushed, pressured, or frightened into leaving. Slowly, Norman's Cay stopped being a sleepy island community and started becoming something darker. A private kingdom rising from white sand and coral reefs. Carlos did not see himself as just a trafficker. He saw himself as a visionary, almost a revolutionary. He spoke of Norman's Cay with kind of fever, describing how it would be the hub that linked Colombia's mountains to America's streets. To his allies, he promised riches. To his enemies, he promised ruin. And behind that manic energy was calculation. Norman's Cay was perfectly placed. A safe halfway point. A staging ground where planes could land, refuel, reload, and leap to Florida. Each trip multiplied profits. Each successful flight tightened his grip. Militarizing the island was as important as buying it. Carlos brought in guards armed with machine guns, men loyal not to law or government, but to him. They patrolled the beaches, the docks, the airstrip, ensuring that no curious fishermen or wandering tourists strayed too far. The island, once quiet, now echoed with the sound of engines, weapons, and money changing hands. Locals who had once fished those waters whispered about men with rifles, about planes landing at midnight, about an island no one dared approach. The transformation was shocking. What had been a tropical escape became something like a military base. Barbed wire, watchtowers, patrol boats circling the waters. Every detail fed Carlos's obsession with control. He was not content to trust chance. He wanted every inch of Norman's Cay to remind people that this was his domain, his fortress. And in the glow of his vision, others began to believe it too. Pilots flew with more confidence, knowing they had a secure landing point. Traffickers routed their shipments through the island. Money poured in faster than ever. But Norman's Cay was more than logistics. It became myth. Stories spread of wild parties, where traffickers drank champagne on the beach, women danced under the stars, and kilos of cocaine lay piled like sandcastles. To outsiders, it sounded like fantasy. To insiders, it was real. The island was both fortress and playground, a place where danger and decadence blurred. For Carlos, it was proof he had transcended the petty hustles of his youth. He wasn't a thief anymore. He wasn't just a smuggler. He was a king on his own island. Yet kings are always watched. U.S. authorities began to take notice. Radar picked up unusual traffic in and out of Norman's Cay. Reports trickled in from fishermen and tourists. Whispers of cocaine empires spread through law enforcement agencies. The DEA began sketching maps, connecting dots, realizing that one tiny island had become a key artery in a growing storm. But the island was not easy to touch. The Bahamas had its own politics, its own corruption. Money spoke loudly, and Carlos made sure it spoke on his behalf. For now, he was safe. The decision to build Norman's Cay into a hub was not just strategy. It was ego. Carlos wanted to be remembered not as another trafficker, but as an innovator, a man who reshaped the trade itself. He loved to boast that he wasn't just moving cocaine, he was creating infrastructure. Like a railroad baron of the underworld, carving new routes, building networks that would outlast him. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Norman's Cay did reshape the cocaine trade. It became the model others try to copy, the blueprint for large-scale smuggling. But ambition is never satisfied. As the island hardened into a fortress, Carlos grew more reckless. He flaunted his wealth. He spoke openly of his vision, drawing attention when secrecy mattered most. His men feared his temper as much as they admired his brilliance. Allies worried he was pushing too hard, too fast. The island was secure, yes, but security is fragile when built on violence and bribes. It only takes one leak, one betrayal, one miscalculation for paradise to turn into ruin. And in the quiet moments, away from the noise of engines and gunfire, Some on the island wondered if Carlos had trapped himself in his own dream. Norman's Cay was no longer just a hub. It was a target, a glowing beacon on the map, drawing the eyes of governments, rivals, and anyone hungry to challenge him. He believed he could control it all. But history shows that empires built on powder are as unstable as the product itself. One spark, one storm, and the whole structure can collapse. The last image of this chapter is not of a triumphant king surrounded by riches. It is of a man standing on the airstrip at sunset, watching a plane lift off heavy with cocaine, the roar shaking the palms. His eyes are lit with pride, with hunger, with certainty that he has bent the world to his will. But in the distance, storm clouds are gathering. The island that feels like invincibility may yet prove to be his downfall. The first thing visitors noticed was the silence. Norman's Cay was supposed to be a Bahamian paradise, waves lapping against white sand, palm fronds rustling in the breeze, birds calling across turquoise skies. But when planes descended onto its narrow strip of asphalt, the quiet was broken by something else. The sight of armed men, rifles slung across their chests, watching every move. Paradise had been transformed into something surreal, equal parts resort and military camp. For anyone who stepped onto the island, it was clear this was not a place of leisure anymore. This was the headquarters of an empire. Carlos Lehder's vision had taken root, and he poured money into Norman's Cay as though it were the altar of his religion. He expanded the airstrip, lengthening it to handle heavier planes, the kind that could carry thousands of pounds of cocaine at once. Construction crews worked under the pretense of legitimate development, but everyone knew the truth. This wasn't tourism. This was infrastructure for a trade that had outgrown suitcases and couriers. The runway became the artery of the Medellin pipeline, and Lehder was its heartbeat. Around the airstrip, the island was fortified. Guard posts rose where there had once been picnic spots. Patrols walked the beaches. Boats circled offshore, not for fishing, but for surveillance. Anyone approaching too close was intercepted, questioned, sometimes beaten, sometimes worse. Locals who had once lived here were gone, forced out by money, intimidation, or violence. In their place came soldiers, mercenaries, and smugglers, men who understood that loyalty meant survival and disobedience meant death. The island breathed paranoia. Yet, strangely, it also breathed excess. Cocaine brought money faster than anyone could count, and that money bought decadence. Norman's Cay became a paradox, part fortress, part playground. At night, the airstrip that ferried tons of cocaine by day became the backdrop for parties that blurred into dawn. Champagne sprayed over cocaine-fueled revelers, women flown in to entertain traffickers, music echoing across the water. It was both terrifying and seductive, a carnival staged on a powder keg. Carlos thrived in this chaos. He moved through the parties like a king, boasting of his vision, intoxicated not just by drugs, but by power. He loved the spectacle, the idea that he had created a world apart from the rest of civilization, an island where his word was law. He liked to tell visitors that Norman's Cay wasn't just a smuggling hub. It was history in the making. He wasn't just trafficking. He was innovating, building the future. In his eyes, he wasn't a criminal. He was a pioneer. But even pioneers have enemies. The U.S. government was watching more closely now, aware that something massive was unfolding in the Bahamas. Reports trickled in of armed men, of mysterious planes landing at odd hours, of shipments moving like clockwork. Satellites and radar painted a picture of unusual activity around Norman's Cay. Yet every attempt to get closer was frustrated by the island's defenses. The guards, the boats, the bribes, all of it worked to keep outsiders at bay. For a time, it seemed Lehder's fortress was untouchable. His methods were as ruthless as they were effective. Trespassers were treated with suspicion, sometimes with brutality. Fishermen who drifted too close were warned off with gunfire. A few who ignored the warnings never returned. Word spread quickly among locals. Stay away from Norman's Cay. It became a ghost island to outsiders, spoken of in whispers, its reputation as dangerous as it was glamorous. Fear was part of the defense system, as strong as barbed wire or rifles. Inside the fortress, however, Lehder cultivated loyalty. He paid his men well, lavished them with luxuries, made them feel like part of something grand. Guards who once scraped by his soldiers now lived in villas, drank imported liquor, and pocketed stacks of cash. Pilots who risked their lives crossing the skies were treated like celebrities, rewarded with cars, women, and enough money to silence their doubts. It was a system built not only on fear but on seduction. And it worked, at least for a while. The sheer volume of cocaine moving through Norman's Cay was staggering. Plane after plane landed heavy, offloaded bricks of powder, refueled, and took off again under the cloak of night. Tons of cocaine flowed through the island, feeding Miami, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond. Each successful shipment tightened Lehder's grip, expanded his wealth, inflated his ego. He began to see himself not just as a trafficker, but as untouchable, someone operating on a level far above law or consequence. The parties reflected that arrogance. Guests included smugglers, politicians, entertainers, even corrupt officials who enjoyed the spoils of Lehder's empire. Rumors spread of mountains of cocaine laid out on silver trays, of orgies that blurred with violence, of wild scenes that made the island infamous even among criminals. Norman's Cay was no longer a secret. It was a legend in the making, a place whispered about from Medellin to Miami. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. The island was expensive to maintain. Guards needed to be paid. Boats needed to be fueled. Pilots demanded more money as risks grew. Every shipment carried the chance of disaster. Planes crashed into the sea. Kilos were lost. Associates disappeared with cash. And the more the island grew in reputation, the more it drew attention. Secrecy was slipping away, replaced by myth, and myth always attracted hunters. Even Lehder's allies in the Medellin cartel began to worry. His flamboyance contrasted sharply with Pablo Escobar's preference for shadows. Lehder craved the spotlight, the infamy, the sense of being larger than life. For Escobar, that was dangerous. For Carlos, it was irresistible. He wanted the world to know his name, to know that Norman's Cay was his creation, his monument. But visibility is the enemy of smuggling. The brighter he shone, the more he invited the darkness closing in. Still, he pressed forward. He reinforced the island's defenses, brought in heavier weapons, installed more guards. He turned the airstrip into a runway capable of handling larger planes. He tightened control over the locals, ensuring silence through fear or money. Each measure was another brick in the fortress, another layer of protection for his empire. Yet protection built on paranoia can also become a prison. The island felt secure, but it also felt suffocating. Those inside began to wonder if they were guarding Lehder's kingdom or trapped within it. And Carlos himself began to change. The swagger grew sharper, the temper shorter. Cocaine fueled his paranoia, making him more volatile, more unpredictable. He trusted fewer people, demanded more loyalty, punished even small slights. The fortress he had built was strong, but it reflected his state of mind. Powerful, intimidating, and dangerously unstable. The image of Norman's Cay at its peak is one of contradictions. An island where men in bathing suits sipped champagne beside men carrying machine guns. Where music and laughter echoed from villas while guards patrolled the beaches with rifles. Where planes loaded with cocaine lifted off into the night sky while bonfires burned on the sand. It was paradise and prison, utopia and nightmare, empire and powder keg all at once. And through it all, Carlos stood at the center, intoxicated by his own creation. He believed he had built something untouchable, a fortress so secure that no government, no rival, no betrayal could bring it down. But history is unforgiving. Every empire falls, and every fortress eventually meets a crack it cannot contain. The last image of this chapter is of Carlos on the runway at night, the glow of bonfires reflecting off his face as another plane roared into the sky. His men cheered. His guests drank. His guards kept watch. And in his eyes burned the certainty of a man who thought he had conquered the world. But far beyond the island, forces were gathering, watching, waiting. The fortress felt unbreakable. Yet already, the cracks were beginning to spread. The meeting was quiet, almost unremarkable on the surface. No grand ceremony, no headlines, no witnesses beyond a few trusted men. Yet it marked the moment two worlds collided. One restless visionary obsessed with logistics, and one ruthless dreamer already climbing toward myth. When Carlos Lehder and Pablo Escobar shook hands, they weren't just making an agreement. They were laying the foundation for the most feared cartel the world had ever known. For Lehder, the alliance was validation. He had built Norman's Cay into a fortress, proved that small planes could carry fortunes across the Caribbean skies, and showed the world that cocaine wasn't just a product, but an empire waiting to be constructed. But even empires need allies. Alone, he was bold. With Escobar, he became indispensable. Escobar, by then, was a rising figure in Medellin. He had the connections to growers, the loyalty of sicarios, the vision of a man who wanted to be more than just a trafficker. He wanted to be a kingmaker, a man whose influence reached into politics, business, and culture. But what he needed was a system, a way to move product faster, safer, bigger than anyone else. That was where Carlos came in. Where Escobar saw opportunity in coca leaves, Lehder saw highways in the sky. Together, they fused supply with logistics, violence with vision, ambition with infrastructure. The brilliance of the partnership was in its simplicity. Escobar controlled production, the coca fields, the labs, the endless river of powder flowing from Colombia's mountains. Lehder controlled transport, the planes, the island fortress, the air routes that bypassed borders and guards. One man filled the product. The other man moved it like blood through veins. Together, they created an organism too vast to stop. Carlos loved the role. For once, he wasn't just a hustler chasing scraps. He was the mastermind of logistics, the architect of the airbridge that linked Medellin to Miami. His obsession with planes became the engine of the Medellin cartel. Dozens of flights lifted off from Colombia, skimmed over the sea, landed at Norman's Cay, and then shot into Florida under the cloak of night. Each run carried thousands of pounds. Each run brought millions in profit. And each successful trip tightened Lehder's reputation as the genius behind the wheel of the cartel. It wasn't just mechanics. It was theater. Carlos spoke about the airbridge like a preacher describing salvation. He boasted of how efficient it was, how unstoppable, how even the U.S. government couldn't close the skies. He reveled in the power of numbers, how 1 kilo could turn into 10 times its value in Miami, how one plane could carry hundreds of kilos, how dozens of planes could flood America with a tidal wave of cocaine. He wasn't just moving powder. He was moving history. Escobar, meanwhile, recognized the gift he had in Carlos. He may have found Lehder eccentric, too flamboyant, even reckless at times, but he couldn't deny his value. Lehder's network turned the Medellin cartel from a regional player into an international powerhouse. Without the airbridge, cocaine might have remained a niche product. With it, it became a flood. By the late 1970s, Miami was awash in cocaine. Nightclubs lined with mirrors weren't just for decoration. They were for rails of powder. The demand exploded, and the cartel's profits soared. For Carlos, this was the golden age. Norman's Cay buzzed with activity. Planes landed almost daily, offloading tons of cocaine that were whisked north before the sun rose. Guards patrolled the island, ensuring the fortress remained impenetrable. Parties raged at night, celebrating each successful run. Carlos strutted through it all, proud, manic, certain he was untouchable. He saw himself not just as Escobar's partner, but as his equal, even his superior in vision. He had created the artery that fed the beast. Without him, the Medellin cartel's heart would not beat. Yet the alliance was not without tension. Escobar valued loyalty and secrecy. Carlos valued spectacle and ego. Where Escobar preferred shadows, Lehder craved light. He spoke openly, bragged, gave interviews, flaunted his role as if he wanted the world to know his name. To some in the cartel, this was genius, a show of strength that terrified rivals. To others, it was suicide, drawing attention that no smuggler should ever invite. The seeds of conflict were already there, even as the partnership thrived. The scale of their operation was staggering. Shipments grew from kilos to tons. By some estimates, at the height of the airbridge, planes carried more than 3,000 pounds of cocaine each week. The money was unimaginable, billions flowing through hands so fast it had to be laundered through banks, real estate, even cattle ranches. It was wealth on a scale that blurred into absurdity. Cash was stacked in warehouses. Entire homes were bought just to store dollars. And at the center of that river of money stood Carlos Lehder, proud of the machinery he had built. But money is never just money. It buys power, yes, but it also breeds paranoia. Rivals wanted the routes. Authorities wanted the heads of those responsible. Corruption bought protection, but corruption is fickle. One day a bribe secures silence. The next day the same official sells information. The skies were not as empty as Carlos pretended. U.S. radar grew sharper, DEA surveillance grew closer, and whispers about Norman's Cay grew louder. Even in triumph, danger pressed in. Still, Carlos pushed harder. He believed the air bridge could not be broken. He expanded operations, added more pilots, stretched the system to its limits. For him, restraint was weakness. The Medellin cartel wasn't just a business. It was destiny, and destiny required boldness. Escobar tolerated his arrogance because the system worked. As long as the planes kept landing, as long as the money kept flowing, Lehder remained invaluable. But the unspoken truth was clear. In the cartel, no one was irreplaceable. And beneath the surface, cracks widened. Associates whispered that Lehder was unstable, that cocaine wasn't just his business, but his addiction. His manic energy, once a strength, sometimes spiraled into paranoia and rants. He spoke of politics, of creating movements, of using cartel money to reshape nations. For Escobar, who thought in terms of calculated power, this sounded reckless. For Carlos, it sounded like genius. The partnership worked, but it was also fragile, held together by profit more than trust. The image of this chapter is vivid. Planes roaring off runways, their wings heavy with white cargo. Norman's Cay alive with soldiers and smugglers. The air thick with music and gunpowder. Miami glowing neon, its streets buzzing with dealers feeding a new American obsession. At the heart of it all, Carlos Lehder stands grinning, proud to be the mastermind of the skies. For him, the alliance with Escobar is proof that he has transcended his past, proof that the boy from Armenia and the thief from New York has become a kingmaker. But alliances in the underworld are like storms at sea. They are powerful, but they are unstable. One shift in wind, one crack in trust, and the same tide that lifted you can drag you under. For now, Carlos revels in his role, blind to the dangers gathering around him. He believes he has secured his place in history, and in a way he has. But history, like cocaine, is addictive and unforgiving. It never lets a man walk away clean. The chapter closes on a chilling uncertainty. Lehder and Escobar stand at the height of their power, their partnership flooding America with cocaine and reshaping the underworld. But behind the smiles and champagne lies the truth. In a world built on powder, loyalty is fragile, power is fleeting, and every empire carries the seeds of its collapse. The alliance is strong today. Tomorrow, it may be the crack that breaks them both. The night skies over the Caribbean glowed faintly with moonlight, but to the men gripping the controls of small Cessnas, it may as well have been pitch black. Flying low, barely skimming above the waves, they kept one eye on the horizon and the other on the fuel gauge, their hearts pounding with every gust of wind. Behind them, the cargo held the weight of nations, wrapped bricks of cocaine stacked so tightly that the plane groaned under the strain. Ahead of them, the Florida coast shimmered faintly, promising fortune if they made it, prison if they did not. This was the air bridge, the artery through which tons of white powder flowed into the beating heart of America. The concept was deceptively simple. Planes would take off from Colombia, make the short hop to Norman's Cay, refuel and regroup under the watchful eyes of armed guards, and then leap again across the narrow stretch of water to Florida. It was faster than boats, harder to intercept, and infinitely more profitable. The United States was just a few hours away, and its hunger for cocaine seemed bottomless. Every successful run meant millions. Every successful week meant empires. For Carlos Lehder, the airbridge was more than strategy. It was obsession. He treated it as if he had invented a new science. He mapped routes with a fanatic's precision, instructing pilots on how low to fly, when to cut engines to avoid radar, which fields in Florida could serve as secret landing strips. He spoke of planes as though they were soldiers in a war, each flight a mission that carried the weight of the cartel's future. And for a time, the system worked flawlessly. Plane after plane touched down in Florida, their cargo hidden in barns, warehouses, and even suburban garages before being broken down and shipped into cities across the country. The flood was relentless. By the late 1970s, it was estimated that as much as 70 to 80% of all cocaine entering the United States passed through Norman's Cay. The island was no longer just a hub. It was the beating heart of the American drug epidemic, and the impact was immediate. Miami, once a sleepy retirement city, transformed almost overnight. The cocaine dollars poured in, fueling banks, construction projects, nightclubs, and neighborhoods. The city glittered with sudden wealth. Ferraris lined Ocean Drive. Mansions rose from nothing. Nightclubs pulsed with music, mirrors dusted with powder, celebrities mingling with smugglers as if they belonged to the same tribe. Cocaine wasn't just a drug anymore. It was a lifestyle, a culture, a symbol of the times. But behind the glamour was chaos. Violence stalked Miami's streets as rival dealers fought for turf. Shootings erupted in broad daylight. Corpses piled up in alleys. The city morgue ran out of space. Newspapers called it the cocaine cowboy era, and they weren't wrong. The frontier wasn't cattle or gold anymore. It was powder, and men like Carlos were the barons. For the pilots, the air bridge was a crucible of fear and fortune. Many were young, desperate, some even former military trained in low-altitude flying. They risked everything on each run, knowing that a single mistake, a storm, a radar sweep, an engine stalling over open water, could end their lives. Yet the money was too intoxicating to refuse. One flight could earn more than years of legitimate work. They told themselves they were just couriers, just men moving packages. But each time their wheels touched down in Florida, they carried not just cocaine but the weight of addiction, violence, and corruption that would ripple across America. Law enforcement scrambled to keep up. The DEA, Customs, Coast Guard, they all tried to stem the tide. But the scale was overwhelming. For every plane intercepted, dozens more slipped through. Radar technology was still crude. Budgets were limited, and corruption ate away at efforts from the inside. Officers bought off. Politicians turned blind eyes. Banks quietly laundered cash, preferring profit over principle. The system wasn't just porous. It was complicit. Carlos reveled in it. He boasted to anyone who would listen that America was powerless to stop him. He claimed the skies belonged to him, that Norman's Cay was untouchable, that the United States could deploy all its might and still fail. And for a time, he was right. The cocaine kept flowing. The money kept growing. The Medellin cartel rose from a loose network of smugglers into a global syndicate, its name spoken with fear from Bogota to Washington. But success carried its own poison. The sheer volume of cocaine moving through the air bridge drew attention that could no longer be ignored. Miami newspapers began reporting on the strange wave of violence, the sudden wealth, the whispers of islands in the Bahamas controlled by armed men. Television shows portrayed Miami as both paradise and battlefield. Politicians began demanding answers. And quietly, U.S. agencies began tightening the noose. For the people of Florida, the change was unmistakable. Cocaine wasn't confined to elite nightclubs anymore. It spilled into neighborhoods, schools, workplaces. Addiction rose. Families fractured. Hospitals saw overdoses climb. What had begun as a glamorous high for the rich had become a destructive force that chewed through lives indiscriminately. The flood Carlos unleashed was no longer just a business story. It was a cultural shift, reshaping America's cities in ways no one could fully grasp. Even within the Medellin cartel, tensions simmered. Escobar, practical and ruthless, valued discretion. Lehder, intoxicated by his own brilliance, craved recognition. He wanted to be known as the mastermind behind the airbridge, the man who turned planes into arteries of fortune. To some, his arrogance was inspiring. To others, it was dangerous. The louder he shouted, the more likely the world was to listen, and listening meant scrutiny. But Carlos didn't care. He believed he had bent the world to his will. He strutted across Norman's Cay, proud of the fortress he had built, proud of the river of cocaine flooding through Florida. To him, the airbridge was proof that he was more than just a trafficker. He was an innovator, an architect of history. He compared himself to industrial titans, men who had laid railroads or built skyscrapers. In his mind, the planes were his steel tracks, the cocaine his cargo, and America his marketplace. The truth, however, was darker. Every flight carried not just profit, but seeds of destruction. Every package that landed in Florida meant another addict, another murder, another brick in the wall of chaos that was consuming Miami. And as the violence escalated, the U.S. response hardened. The DEA began coordinating with Bahamian officials. Radar systems improved. Informants crept into the network. The fortress of Norman's Cay wasn't as invisible as Carlos believed. The cracks were forming, even if he refused to see them. The air bridge to Florida became legend, a system so audacious, so profitable, that even decades later, it remains the defining image of the Medellin cartel's rise. Small planes flying low, ferrying tons of cocaine, changing not just economies but cultures. It was daring, it was brilliant, and it was doomed, because no system built on powder and paranoia can last forever. The chapter closes with the image of a plane gliding silently over the waves, its lights off, its engine cut to avoid radar, carrying a cargo that could buy 100 lives or destroy 1,000. Inside, the pilot's hands tremble, torn between fear and greed. In Norman's Cay, Carlos Lehder watches the skies, convinced he has conquered them. But far away, in Miami, Washington, and Nassau, forces are gathering, preparing for the storm. The air bridge is at its peak, and yet, already, its fall has begun. The gunfire came without warning. Miami's sunlit streets, lined with pastel-colored motels and palm trees swaying in the breeze, erupted into chaos as bullets tore through glass and flesh in broad daylight. Shoppers dove for cover. Cars screeched to a halt. In the middle of it all lay the evidence of a new age. Drug money spilling into violence, so brazen it shocked even seasoned cops. This was no longer smuggling in the shadows. This was open war, fought not in jungles or deserts, but in American neighborhoods. And Carlos Lehder's empire was feeding the fire. By the late 1970s and early 80s, Miami was drowning in cocaine. The city had become the entry point for Lehder's air bridge, the funnel through which billions of dollars in white powder poured into America. What followed was a transformation so sudden and violent, it left scars still visible today. Miami, once a sleepy retirement town, was now the cocaine capital of the world. The newspapers gave it a name that stuck, the cocaine cowboy era. At its core was greed. Cocaine money flooded the city faster than anyone could count it. Banks accepted duffel bags of cash with no questions asked. Construction companies sprang up overnight, building towers with laundered dollars. Car dealerships sold Ferraris and Lamborghinis to men who had no jobs but endless cash. Miami's skyline began to change, built on the foundation of powder. Everyone knew the money was dirty. Few cared. In a city where fortunes could be made in weeks, morality was just another casualty. But with greed came blood. Rival traffickers fought for control of distribution. Colombian hitmen, flown in from Medellin, prowled the streets. Shootouts erupted in shopping malls, at gas stations, even on crowded highways. Families huddled inside as gunfire echoed through neighborhoods. The morgue filled faster than the city could bury its dead. Detectives, hardened by years of crime, spoke of levels of violence they had never seen before. Miami wasn't just dangerous. It was a battlefield. Carlos Lehder was not the only architect of this chaos, but his airbridge helped make it possible. Every plane that touched down in Florida carried not just cocaine, but the seeds of violence. Each kilo meant another shipment sold on the streets, another deal disputed, another life at risk. He may not have pulled the triggers in Miami, but the bullets had his fingerprints. To the people of Miami, the changes were surreal. Nightclubs pulsed with energy, filled with celebrities, models, and traffickers drinking side by side. Cocaine was no longer hidden. It was flaunted, poured onto mirrors and tables like sugar at a diner. For the wealthy, it became a status symbol. For the poor, it became an escape. The drug culture seeped into every layer of society, blurring lines between glamour and destruction. Law enforcement struggled to respond. The DEA was overwhelmed. Local police were outgunned. Corruption spread like wildfire, with officers and politicians quietly pocketing bribes to look the other way. Some banks became little more than laundromats, washing billions in cartel money. It was said that Miami's economy would have collapsed without the cocaine dollars. In a sense, the city was being built by the very product tearing it apart. Lehder himself thrived in this storm. From Norman's Cay, he watched as his empire fed Miami's hunger. He boasted of his role, bragged that the city's transformation was proof of his genius. While Escobar preferred to move in shadows, Carlos reveled in attention. He gave interviews, flaunted his wealth, and positioned himself as more than a trafficker. In his mind, he was a revolutionary, reshaping the world with planes and powder. But revolution, like cocaine, carries a heavy cost. Inside Miami, fear lived alongside glamour. Families who once enjoyed quiet suburban lives now locked their doors and prayed stray bullets would not pierce their windows. Business owners paid protection money to stay alive. Journalists wrote about the blood in the streets, painting Miami as a war zone. The image was not exaggerated. Drive-by shootings were weekly occurrences. Bodies stacked in morgues. The drug wars were real, and they were tearing the city apart. Still, the money blinded many. For every funeral, there was a mansion rising on the waterfront. For every headline about violence, there was another nightclub opening, filled with neon lights and mountains of powder. Miami lived in contradiction, paradise and hell, wealth and bloodshed, glamour and decay. And Carlos Lehder's fingerprints were everywhere, even if most had never heard his name. The logistics of his empire fascinated him as much as the chaos. He fine-tuned the airbridge like a conductor leading an orchestra. Planes were scheduled with military precision. Cargo offloaded in Florida with clockwork efficiency. Cash funneled back through laundering networks with the cold accuracy of accountants. It wasn't just smuggling. It was industry. And for Lehder, industry meant power. But power invites rivals. Other traffickers wanted their piece of Miami. Cuban gangs, Colombian independents, and American dealers all fought for control. The violence escalated, spiraling into a level of brutality that even shocked the cartel bosses. The city was no longer just a market. It was a battlefield soaked in blood and cocaine. And every new war front made the spotlight on Norman's Cay brighter. Lehder, however, was intoxicated. He believed the fortress he had built and the alliance he had forged with Escobar made him invincible. He laughed at U.S. authorities, mocked their inability to stop the planes, boasted that the skies belonged to him. And in the short term, he was right. The cocaine kept flowing. The dollars kept stacking. The cartel kept rising. But arrogance blinds even the sharpest visionaries. The cocaine cowboy era was more than violence and money. It was a cultural shift. Movies, music, and television reflected the obsession. Miami Vice wasn't just fiction. It was a mirror of reality. America was fascinated and horrified by Miami's descent. The word cocaine became synonymous with wealth, danger, and excess. And behind that word was a network of men like Lehder, who had turned smuggling into empire. Yet cracks were forming. The U.S. government could no longer ignore the blood in Miami streets or the flood of cocaine through its borders. Task forces were created. Radar improved. Investigations deepened. Norman's Cay, once invisible, began appearing in intelligence reports. Politicians demanded action. The fortress was not as untouchable as Carlos believed. The storm was gathering, and Miami was only the beginning. The last image of this chapter is haunting. Miami at night, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement, the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance. A city alive with energy and drowning in fear. In Norman's Cay, Carlos Lehder stands proud, convinced he has reshaped the world. But in truth, the world is reshaping around him, preparing to close in. The cocaine cowboy era made him a legend. But legends burn brightest just before they fall. The camera light flicked on, and instead of shrinking back into the shadows where most traffickers hid, Carlos Lehder leaned forward, smiling. His hair was slicked, his words rehearsed, his tone brash. On screen, he was no longer just a smuggler, no longer just a man who built an empire of plains and islands. He was a showman, and in that moment, he did something most in his world considered suicidal. He embraced the spotlight. It was the ultimate contradiction. The Medellin cartel thrived on secrecy, on shadows, on silence enforced by fear. But Carlos was different. He wanted recognition. He wanted the world to know his name, to see his face, to hear his voice. In interviews, he spoke not like a criminal, but like a revolutionary. He declared cocaine a commodity as legitimate as coffee or oil, sneering at the hypocrisy of governments who condemned the trade while profiting from other vices. He portrayed himself not as a smuggler, but as a visionary fighting against what he called imperialist oppression. For many, it was shocking. Traffickers were supposed to be invisible, faceless phantoms moving billions in silence. But here was Lehder, defiant, almost gleeful, speaking into cameras as if daring the world to stop him. To law enforcement, it was a gift. Every word he spoke, every boast he made, painted a target larger and larger on his back. But to Carlos, it was intoxicating. Fame was its own drug, and he was hooked. His lifestyle matched the bravado. Norman's Cay had already become infamous for its excess, but Lehder took the decadence everywhere he went. He arrived in convoys of cars, trailed by bodyguards carrying machine guns. He dressed in flashy suits, chains gleaming against his chest, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He surrounded himself with women, with music, with the constant buzz of men eager to bask in his orbit. In an era when most traffickers hid, Lehder flaunted. He was the face of a generation of outlaws who lived as loudly as the guns that enforced their power. This flamboyance made him infamous not just among criminals, but among ordinary people. In Colombia, his name was whispered in awe and fear. In the Bahamas, locals spoke of the madman who had turned a peaceful island into a fortress. In the United States, his image appeared in news reports as one of the masterminds behind the cocaine flooding Miami streets. He had become a symbol, not just of smuggling, but of the arrogance that defined the cocaine era. Yet arrogance has consequences. Every boast tightened the focus of law enforcement. Every interview fed the files being compiled in Washington. Intelligence analysts clipped his words from newspapers, studied his tone on television, noted his confidence. They knew men like Escobar feared attention. Lehder craved it. That craving was his weakness, and they would use it. But Carlos didn't see weakness. He saw validation. He believed his media presence elevated him beyond ordinary traffickers. He called himself a revolutionary, declaring war on extradition treaties, claiming he was fighting for Colombia's sovereignty. He even founded a political movement, pouring drug money into speeches and propaganda. To some, it was laughable. To others, it was terrifying, the idea that a trafficker could turn his fortune into political power. Inside the Medellin cartel, his behavior caused tension. Escobar valued control, subtle manipulation, the quiet building of empires. Lehder's flamboyance was reckless, drawing eyes the cartel didn't want. But his value as the architect of the airbridge kept him safe, at least for a time. Escobar tolerated his antics because the planes kept flying, the money kept flowing, and Norman's Cay remained indispensable. Still, murmurs grew. Carlos was too loud, too proud, too willing to gamble with the cartel's secrecy. His infamy spread beyond television. He became legend in Miami, spoken of in the same breath as the violence tearing through the city. In nightclubs, people whispered that their cocaine had passed through his island, flown in on planes he had orchestrated. In law enforcement circles, his name was synonymous with audacity. He wasn't just another trafficker. He was the one who dared to stand in front of cameras and sneer the system. But behind the bravado was fragility. His drug use deepened, feeding paranoia, fueling manic rants that unsettled even his closest allies. He swung between moments of charm and explosions of rage, between calculated brilliance and reckless indulgence. His infamy was both armor and poison. The more he embraced it, the more he alienated those who valued discretion, and the more he drew enemies determined to silence him. For the public, however, he remained a paradox. To some Colombians, he was a folk hero, a man who stood up to the United States, who declared cocaine not a crime, but a business. To others, he was a madman dragging their country into chaos. In the Bahamas, he was both feared and ridiculed, remembered for his armed guards and wild parties. In America, he became the face of the faceless, the trafficker who had given cocaine a personality, a voice, a smirk. The irony was cruel. Lehder wanted to be remembered as a visionary, but the vision he left was one of destruction. Every boast was shadowed by blood in Miami streets, by addicts in hospital beds, by families torn apart. He may have called himself a revolutionary, but history would not see him as liberator. It would see him as one of the architects of a nightmare. And yet, in those years, he could not see the cracks. The money was still flowing. Norman's Cay was still secure. The cartel was still rising. In his mind, infamy was power, and power was immortality. He had no interest in shadows. He wanted his name written in bold letters across the era. And for a time, he got what he wanted. The last image of this chapter is chilling. A television screen flickering in a dark room, Lehder's face filling it, eyes gleaming as he declares cocaine a weapon against imperialism. Outside that room, families grieve the victims of the drug wars, authorities sharpen their strategies, and rivals whisper about his recklessness. He smiles into the camera, believing he has bent history to his will. But in truth, history is already bending against him. The louder he speaks, the closer the storm draws. The crowd was restless, unsure whether to cheer or laugh. On the makeshift stage stood a man dressed like a politician, but speaking like a prophet. His voice rose above the din, promising a new Colombia, a nation free from what he called foreign chains. He wasn't talking about poverty or roads or schools. He was talking about cocaine, not as a vice, not as a crime, but as Colombia's salvation. The man was Carlos Lehder, and he wasn't just trafficking anymore. He was trying to turn powder into politics. It was a surreal sight. Traffickers built empires in shadows, bribed politicians, corrupted governments. But Lehder wanted something different. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted cocaine not hidden in crates and planes, but enshrined in law. He founded a movement he called the National Latin Movement, a strange hybrid of populism, nationalism, and his own manic ideology. Its central message was as audacious as it was dangerous. Legalize cocaine, fight U.S. influence, and turn Colombia into a nation that profited openly from the product the world secretly consumed. To some, it sounded insane. To others, it was a fantasy they had always whispered but never dared say aloud. After all, cocaine had already transformed Colombia's economy. Farmers, smugglers, politicians, bankers, everyone was touched by its wealth. Why not embrace it openly? Why let the United States dictate morality while profiting from oil and tobacco. Lehder's speeches tapped into resentment that simmered in the streets. He painted the U.S. as a bully, an imperialist power exploiting Colombia while condemning it. He offered cocaine as a weapon of independence, a commodity that could lift the nation from poverty. The irony was bitter. He spoke of national pride while his own empire drenched Miami in blood. He called for sovereignty, while Norman's Cay served as a staging ground for chaos. Yet when he stood before crowds, his words carried a strange conviction. He believed them, or at least, he convinced himself he did. But politics is not built on conviction alone. It is built on alliances, money, and silence. Lehder had money, more than most parties in Colombia combined. But what he lacked was subtlety. He printed pamphlets, gave interviews, shouted his vision to anyone who would listen. He wasn't just another trafficker funding politicians from the shadows. He was the politician, standing in front of cameras, daring the world to question him. For law enforcement, it was a nightmare turned opportunity. Every word he spoke made him easier to target. Within the Medellin cartel, unease deepened. Pablo Escobar also dabbled in politics, running for Congress in hopes of laundering his image. But Escobar moved cautiously, buying legitimacy through charity and manipulation. Lehder, by contrast, was a firebrand. His speeches were incendiary, his ideology too loud, too radical. Escobar saw utility in politics. Lehder saw destiny. To Escobar, cocaine was a tool. To Lehder, it was a flag to wave in defiance. This difference mattered. Escobar valued survival. Lehder courted martyrdom. And in a business where survival meant everything, martyrdom was poison. Still, Lehder pressed forward. He staged rallies, distributed leaflets, thundered about the hypocrisy of criminalizing cocaine. He declared the fight against extradition, the U.S. demand that traffickers be tried on American soil, as a central cause. To him, extradition was a betrayal of sovereignty, a way for Colombia to bow to a foreign master. He wasn't alone in this belief. Many Colombians, even those not tied to the cartel, feared extradition. It symbolized weakness, the erosion of independence. Lehder tapped into that fear, amplifying it, claiming he was the champion who would resist. For a brief moment, it almost worked. His movement drew crowds, especially among the poor, who saw little benefit from government but felt the trickle of cocaine money in their communities. To them, Lehder's defiance against the United States was intoxicating. They saw him not as a criminal, but as a man willing to stand up to powers that had long humiliated their nation. His message was dangerous precisely because it resonated, but also exposed him. His face was now everywhere. His words quoted in papers. His name tied not just to smuggling, but to politics. For law enforcement, it was a gift. For the cartel, it was a liability. Rivals whispered that his arrogance would bring heat on everyone. Associates wondered if his drug use was driving him into delusion. Even allies questioned whether he understood the stakes. In a business built on silence, he was shouting into megaphones. The U.S. government responded with fury. They saw Lehder not just as a trafficker, but as a threat to international order. A man openly advocating legalized cocaine was dangerous, not because legalization was likely, but because his voice carried weight in a nation already drowning in cartel money. Washington pushed harder on Colombia, demanding action, warning that if men like Lehder weren't stopped, chaos would consume the hemisphere. Meanwhile, Lehder spiraled deeper into his own myth. He compared himself to revolutionaries, to men who fought empires with ideology and fire. He saw the cocaine trade not as organized crime, but as a liberation movement. To those close to him, it was clear the line between belief and delusion had blurred. He ranted for hours, spoke of creating a new world, imagined himself not just as a trafficker or a politician, but as a historic figure. Cocaine wasn't just his product. It was his religion. The fallout was inevitable. Authorities began closing in on Norman's Cay, the pressure building. Escobar distanced himself, careful not to be tied too closely to Lehder's political circus. Other cartel leaders muttered about removing him altogether. The crowds that once cheered began to shrink, intimidated by violence, exhausted by rhetoric. And behind it all, the U.S. and Colombian governments coordinated, determined to silence the loudest voice in the cartel. The final image of this chapter is stark. Lehder standing before a crowd, his voice echoing through loudspeakers, declaring that Colombia will never bow to extradition, that cocaine is not a curse but a gift. His supporters cheer, some with genuine conviction, others out of fear or curiosity. But beyond the lights of the rally, shadows gather, law enforcement plotting his downfall, rivals whispering of betrayal, allies calculating his worth. He believes he is writing history. In truth, he is writing his obituary. The room was heavy with silence. Outside, guards paced with rifles, the airstrip of Norman's cave buzzing faintly in the distance. Inside, two men sat across from each other, their eyes locked in a quiet war. One radiated cold calculation, the other restless energy. One preferred shadows, the other craved the spotlight. They had built an empire together, but now, cracks were spreading in its foundation. This was not just a conversation. It was the beginning of a split that could unravel everything. Carlos Lehder and Pablo Escobar had once seemed like the perfect partnership. One provided the supply, the other the transport. One ruled Medellin with quiet brutality. The other transformed an island into a fortress of plains and profit. Together, they had flooded Miami, reshaped America's drug culture, and amassed fortunes so vast they could not be counted. But fortunes are easier to share than power, and power was the shadow looming between them. Escobar was a man of control. He valued silence, loyalty, secrecy. His empire was built not only on violence, but on invisibility, the ability to blend criminality into politics, charity, and fear. He wanted to be untouchable, not flamboyant. Lehder was the opposite. He thrived on spectacle. He gave interviews, staged rallies, boasted of his role in the cartel. He didn't just want money. He wanted fame, legitimacy, immortality. To Escobar, this wasn't vision. It was recklessness. The tension grew with every word Lehder spoke to the media. Each time his face appeared in a newspaper, Escobar clenched his jaw. Each time Lehder thundered about politics and cocaine as a national savior, Escobar saw risk. For the Medellin cartel, silence was survival. For Carlos, silence was suffocation. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided. Within the cartel, whispers began. Associates noticed the difference in style, the friction in meetings, the moments of quiet anger between the two men. Escobar, calm and methodical, warned against attracting attention. Lehder, manic and brash, dismissed those warnings, convinced his way was destiny. To the men caught in the middle, it was like watching tectonic plates shift. No one wanted to choose sides, but everyone knew a rupture was coming. Lehder's cocaine use only fueled the instability. Already prone to paranoia and rants, the drug amplified his excesses. He spoke endlessly, sometimes into the night, about revolution, about destiny, about reshaping the world with cocaine. To some, his energy was inspiring. To others, it was madness. Escobar, who prided himself on discipline, grew impatient. A partner who could not control himself was not an asset. He was a liability. The alliance had been built on need, but now Escobar needed Lehder less. The airbridge was established. Other pilots, other routes, other islands could be used. Norman's Cay, once indispensable, was becoming too notorious. For Escobar, Lehder's genius had already served its purpose. What remained was his noise, and noise was dangerous. But breaking with Lehder wasn't simple. He was too loud, too visible, too proud. Removing him could spark chaos within the network. Keeping him risked bringing down the wrath of governments. Escobar weighed his options carefully, never revealing his hand, while Lehder spiraled further in his self-made myth. The dynamic shifted. Lehder believed he was Escobar's equal. Escobar knew he was not, and that imbalance was fatal. Their personalities clashed not just in strategy, but in vision. Escobar dreamed of political power through manipulation, buying politicians, building schools, feeding the poor, weaving his image into the fabric of Colombia. Lehder wanted revolution, confrontation, fireworks. He saw himself as a Che Guevara of cocaine, a man who would lead the world into a new age. Escobar saw this as foolish. Revolutionaries end up dead. Kings survive. Associates began to notice the rift. Meetings grew tense. Lehder interrupted, boasting of his accomplishments, dismissing warnings. Escobar listened quietly, his eyes cold, his words fewer. Those who had known him long enough recognized the signs. When Escobar grew silent, it meant he was calculating. And calculations in his world usually ended in blood. At Norman's Cay, Lehder carried on as though nothing was wrong. Parties still raged. Planes still landed. Guards still patrolled. He strutted through his fortress like a monarch, convinced he was untouchable. But beneath the surface, his paranoia deepened. He began distrusting even his closest allies, convinced spies lurked in every corner. He accused pilots of betrayal, guards of disloyalty, even friends of plotting against him. The island, once a hub of power, began to feel like a prison of suspicion. Meanwhile, Escobar tightened his circle. He leaned more on trusted lieutenants, men who valued discretion, men who understood his vision of control. Lehder's absence in critical meetings spoke volumes. Slowly, quietly, Escobar began moving beyond him. The airbridge that had once made Lehder indispensable was no longer the cartel's only artery. His fortress, once unique, was becoming replaceable. And in a world where replaceability is weakness, Lehder's power was crumbling. Yet Lehder remained blind to the danger. His ego shielded him from reality. He believed he was too important, too innovative, too legendary to be cut down. He mistook Escobar's silence for respect, when in truth it was calculation. The storm was gathering, but Carlos danced in the rain, oblivious to the lightning on the horizon. The contrast between them became legend. Escobar, the cold king of shadows, and Lehder, the flamboyant clown prince of cocaine. One plotted, the other ranted. One silenced threats, the other shouted into microphones. Together, they had built an empire. But together, they could not last. The cracks in their alliance were not just personal. They were structural, inevitable, written into the DNA of two men who wanted power in different forms. The cartel itself began to shift. Loyalty bent toward Escobar, the man who controlled not just cocaine but fear. Lehder, increasingly erratic, alienated those who once admired him. His fortress felt more like a relic, his political rants more like noise. And yet, he continued, blind to the isolation tightening around him. The more he shouted, the lonelier his voice became. The chapter closes with an image both powerful and tragic. Carlos Lehder pacing the runway of Norman's Cay at night, planes roaring into the dark sky, guards watching nervously as he rants about destiny and revolution. In Medellin, Escobar sits in silence, calculating, his empire expanding, his patience thinning. The two men are still allies, still part of the same storm. But the fissures are deepening, and everyone can feel it. An empire built on powder cannot withstand division. And soon, one of them will have to fall. The meeting room in Nassau was stifling, its air thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken tension. American officials leaned forward across polished wood tables, folders stacked in front of them, photographs scattered like evidence of a crime scene. Each image told the same story. Small planes lined up on a narrow airstrip, armed men patrolling sandy beaches, pallets of cocaine stacked inside villas. The officials' voices were calm, but their meaning was blunt. The Bahamas had become a pipeline for America's drug problem, and at the center of that storm was Norman's Cay. The time for silence was over. By the early 1980s, the United States was no longer just concerned. It was desperate. Miami was drowning in cocaine, violence spilling into suburbs, morgues overflowing, banks washing billions in drug money. Behind the headlines, investigators traced the river of powder back to the same on the map, a sleepy Bahamian island transformed into a fortress by Carlos Lehder. To American eyes, Norman's Cay was not just a hub. It was a symbol of their failure, a brazen insult to their authority. And symbols could not be tolerated. Pressure came like waves. American diplomats warned Bahamian leaders in private. Intelligence agencies leaked stories to the press, painting Norman's Cay as a paradise-turned-pirate kingdom. Congressional hearings thundered with outrage, politicians demanding to know how such a small nation could allow traffickers to operate so openly. Each headline, each speech, tightened the noose. The Bahamas, relying on tourism and vulnerable to foreign aid, could not afford to look like a safe haven for cartels. But things were not so simple. Lehder's money ran deep. Bribes flowed like rum at a festival, buying silence from officials, securing protection from police, blinding regulators. For years, Norman's Cay had thrived in the shadows of corruption. The island's transformation was not just the work of smugglers. It was also the result of quiet agreements, whispered deals, envelopes passed under tables. Breaking that web was not just dangerous. It was explosive. American officials understood this, but they pressed harder. They produced satellite images of planes on the runway, intercepted radio chatter between pilots, financial trails leading from Miami banks back to Bahamian accounts. Each piece of evidence was another weapon, another reason the Bahamas could no longer deny the obvious. In closed-door meetings, they reminded leaders what was at stake. Aid packages, trade agreements, military cooperation. The message was clear: dismantle Norman's Cay, or face consequences. Inside Bahamian halls of power, fear spread. Some officials worried about losing American support. Others worried about cartel retribution. Everyone knew the stakes. To move against Lehder meant risking his wrath. To do nothing meant risking America's. It was a choice between two predators circling the same island, each demanding obedience, each capable of destruction. Meanwhile, on Norman's Cay, life carried on as if nothing had changed. Planes still landed at night, offloading tons of cocaine. Guards still patrolled beaches, their rifles gleaming in the sun. Parties still roared, champagne spilling over marble floors, cocaine piled like sugar on silver trays. Lehder strutted through his fortress, convinced that his bribes had secured his paradise, that no one would dare challenge his kingdom. He laughed at the Americans, mocked their inability to stop him, boasted that the Bahamas belonged to him. But cracks were showing. Fishermen whispered of increased patrols near the island. Journalists in Nassau asked questions too dangerous just a year before. Rumors spread of American agents visiting Bahamian ministers late at night. Some locals refused to go near Norman's Cay, afraid of being caught between traffickers and authorities. The fear that once protected the island was beginning to turn against it. The Americans escalated. They proposed joint task forces, offered equipment, promised training. Behind the offers was a simple truth: Washington wanted Lehder gone. His fortress had become too famous, too visible, too embarrassing. The Bahamas, long caught in the middle, began to bend. Slowly, quietly, officials shifted. Some bribes were refused. Some orders were enforced. The first moves were small: increased scrutiny on flights, tighter controls on certain banks. But even small cracks can bring down walls. For Lehder, the changes were subtle but alarming. A shipment delayed. A rumor of officials asking too many questions. A pilot whispering about tighter patrols. His paranoia, already fueled by cocaine, deepened. He raged at his men, accused them of betrayal, demanded loyalty with increasing ferocity. The island, once a playground, grew tense. Guards watched each other as much as outsiders. The fortress was still intact, but the foundations were trembling. In Washington, satisfaction grew. Each sign of movement in Nassau was proof that pressure worked. But American officials also knew time was short. Lehder's empire was too entrenched, his defenses too strong. If the Bahamas hesitated, the window could close. They pushed harder, reminding leaders of corruption scandals that could explode, of banking ties that could collapse under scrutiny. It was carrot and stick, promise and threat. And it was working. The Bahamian government faced a storm of its own making. On one side, traffickers who had bought their silence. On the other, a superpower demanding action. Every decision carried risk. Some ministers feared assassination if they betrayed Lehder. Others feared isolation if they defied Washington. The country's reputation, its economy, even its sovereignty hung in the balance. And all the while, Carlos remained defiant. In his speeches, he mocked the Americans. In his fortress, he tightened his grip. But deep down, the cracks gnawed at him. He had built Norman's Cay to be untouchable, a paradise of control. Now whispers of betrayal echoed through its palm trees. The same paradise was beginning to feel like a trap. The chapter closes with a chilling image. In Nassau, Bahamian leaders sit in silence as American officials slide photographs across a table. Proof of Norman's Cay, proof of corruption, proof of complicity. The officials' voices are calm, but their message is thunder. The island must fall. On Norman's Cay, Carlos Lehder paces the runway under the Caribbean sun, unaware of how close the storm has come. He still believes he is safe. But in the corridors of power, decisions are being made that will seal his fate. The first boots hit the sand just after dawn. Bahamian forces, flanked by quiet American advisors, stepped on in Norman's Cay with weapons raised, scanning for movement. The airstrip, once alive with the roar of small planes carrying fortunes in cocaine, now lay silent under a heavy sky. For years, this tiny island had been Lehder's kingdom, his fortress, his playground. But kingdoms built on powder never last. And this morning, paradise was about to collapse. The operation was not sudden. It had been building for months, fed by relentless American pressure. Washington had made its position clear. Norman's Cay was an embarrassment to U.S. power, a thorn in the side of their war on drugs. Each day the island operated was a reminder of their failure. For the Bahamas' choice became survival. Stand with Lehder and risk isolation, sanctions, even invasion of reputation. Stand with the Americans and risk the cartel's fury. In the end, the decision was inevitable. The first move came quietly. Bank accounts frozen, flights scrutinized, whispers of police interest. For Lehder, used to impunity, it was infuriating. He raged at his men, accused officials of betrayal, doubled down on bribes. But corruption has limits. When the U.S. put its weight behind the campaign, the tide turned. Bahamian officials, once content to look away, now scrambled to appear clean. The storm was coming, and no one wanted to be caught in its path. Then came the raids. Boats appeared on the horizon, carrying government forces. Helicopters thundered overhead, circling like hawks over prey. The island's guards, once so confident, now looked uncertain. They had rifles, yes, but against governments? Against two nations breathing down their necks? The fight drained before it even began. Some dropped their weapons. Others melted into the trees. The fortress that had once terrified locals suddenly felt hollow. For the residents still clinging to Norman's Cay, the transformation was terrifying. Villas that once rang with music and laughter now echoed with shouts and boots. The runways that once sparkled under moonlight landings now sat abandoned, their asphalt cracking under the sun. The paradise Lehder had built, a place where traffickers toasted fortunes and pilots gambled with death, was unraveling before their eyes. And where was Carlos? Not on the island. By the time the raids began in earnest, Lehder had already slipped away, hiding in Colombia, convinced he could outmaneuver governments the way he had once outmaneuvered radar. To him, Norman's Cay was just a chapter, but for the men left behind, it was a tomb. The Americans watched with satisfaction. For years, Norman's Cay had been the centerpiece of their humiliation, a symbol of their inability to stop the flow of cocaine. Now, photographs of Bahamian forces seizing villas, of airstrips under guard, of smugglers fleeing in boats, became proof that progress was possible. Politicians in Washington claimed victory. But victory in the drug war is never clean. The cocaine routes shifted almost immediately. Other islands, other jungles, other networks filled the gap. Norman's Cay fell, but the river of powder did not stop. For Lehder, the loss cut deeper. Norman's Cay had not just been a base. It had been his dream, his monument to ambition. He had poured money, blood, and ego into that island, convinced it made him untouchable. Watching it fall was like watching his reflection shatter. The fortress he had boasted about, the paradise he claimed was impregnable, had been taken without him even firing a shot. The humiliation burned, though he never admitted it. The fall also shifted power inside the cartel. Escobar and others had long grown weary of Lehder's antics, his ego, his political rants. With Norman's K gone, so too went his greatest leverage. He was no longer the mastermind of the skies, no longer the man who controlled the artery into America. The cartel could find other pilots, other islands, other paths. Lehder's uniqueness vanished with the fall of his fortress. And in Medellin, when a man ceased to be useful, his days were numbered. The island itself became a ghost. Once filled with soldiers, smugglers, and revelers, it now sat abandoned, its villas crumbling, its runway cracked and overgrown. Locals who had feared even sailing near it now whispered of its past, pointing to broken walls and empty pools as relics of an empire that rose and fell in less than a decade. Norman's Cay became legend, a story told with both awe and dread, a reminder of how quickly power can vanish when the world turns against you. Yet the fall was not just about a place. It was about the message. For years, Lehder had mocked the Americans, claimed his island was invincible, boasted that no one could touch him. When Norman's Cay fell, it proved him wrong. It showed the world that even the boldest fortress could be dismantled, that even the loudest trafficker could be silenced. It was a warning to others in the cartel. Arrogance attracts storms. Still, Carlos convinced himself it was temporary. He told allies the island didn't matter, that he still had connections, that his vision extended far beyond a strip of sand in the Bahamas. But the truth gnawed at him. Without Norman's Cay, he was just another trafficker hiding in Colombia. His myth had been built on that island, and its collapse left him exposed. He was not invincible. He was vulnerable, and in his world, vulnerability was fatal. The chapter closes on a haunting image. The sun setting over Norman's Cay, its once busy runway empty, the echo of waves crashing against abandoned villas. A patrol boat drifts past, Bahamian soldiers scanning the shoreline where traffickers once partied with champagne and guns. In Colombia, Carlos Lehder hides in shadows, still ranting of revolution, still clinging to the illusion of control. But deep down he knows. The fortress is gone, the dream has crumbled, and the world is closing in. The mansion lights have gone dark. No more champagne, no more music spilling out into the Caribbean night. Norman's Cay was gone, stripped away in raids and political pressure, and with it Carlos Lehder's most powerful symbol. Now, he moved like a shadow through Colombia, slipping between safe houses, speaking in whispers, his paranoia growing with every step. For a man who once strutted through the spotlight, basking in his own infamy, the silence was suffocating. But survival demanded it. Lehder was underground. The fall of Norman's Cay had shaken him, but it had not destroyed him. The Medellin cartel was still strong, and his partnership with Escobar still gave him relevance. Cocaine flowed through new routes, rivers, jungle strips, hidden coves, and the profits remained staggering. But the dynamics had changed. Once, Lehder had been indispensable, the architect of the airbridge, the man who connected Colombia to Miami with wings of steel. Now, others could replicate what he had built. His genius was no longer unique. His presence, once a strength, had become a liability. In Medellin, Escobar continued to expand. His empire grew more sophisticated, his influence deeper, his control more ruthless. He built entire neighborhoods to win loyalty, paid off politicians, murdered enemies with cold precision. Lehder watched, restless. He had the money, the connections, the fire, but not the same discipline. Where Escobar moved like a chess master, Lehder still played with dice, reckless and loud, even when silence was survival. Still, the underground years were not without power. Lehder managed operations, coordinated shipments, leverage his old contacts. The cocaine economy was booming, and as long as tons of powder reached American shores, he remained valuable. But every move carried risk. American agents hunted him relentlessly, feeding tips to Colombian authorities, leaning on allies, offering rewards. His name, once a boast, was now a beacon for hunters. Every knock on a door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every rumor of betrayal gnawed at him. The paranoia deepened. Lehder surrounded himself with bodyguards, demanded loyalty at gunpoint, shifted locations constantly. He ranted about spies, about Americans infiltrating his circle, about traitors lurking even among his friends. The cocaine he consumed only fueled the fire, sharpening his mania, making his words come faster, louder, wilder. To some, he sounded inspired. To others, he sounded insane. Either way, the weight of fear pressed down on everyone around him. And yet, the money did not stop. Planes still flew, boats still sailed, bribes still changed hands. In the barrios of Miami, in the nightclubs of New York, in the alleys of Los Angeles, cocaine still poured from the veins of the Medellin cartel. Lehder's fingerprints were still on it, even if less visible than before. He remained a key player, but his role was changing. From visionary to operator, from leader to fugitive. Escobar noticed. He always noticed. The differences between them, once tolerable, now became glaring. Escobar valued loyalty, control, the ability to silence problems. Lehder was too visible, too unstable, too prone to draw fire. Escobar tolerated him because of history, because of the airbridge, because of the profits. But tolerance has limits. In the cartel, usefulness is the only currency, and Lehder's balance was running low. For Lehder, the underground life was both prison and lifeline. He hated hiding, hated the shadows, hated the silence. He missed the spotlight, the interviews, the stage of politics. But he also knew that without caution, he would be dead or in chains. Every day was a contradiction, the desire to be seen, the need to disappear. It wore on him, driving him deeper into drugs, deeper into paranoia, deeper into the spiral of self-destruction. His men felt it too. The atmosphere around him shifted from celebration to tension. Gone were the wild parties of Norman's Cay. In their place were whispered conversations, tense nights, eyes scanning every window. Bodyguards lived on edge, knowing their boss's temper could explode at any moment, knowing that the Americans were not far behind, knowing that even the cartel itself might turn against him. The U.S. tightened the pressure. They coordinated with Colombia, shared intelligence, spread propaganda, turned former allies into informants. Lehder's name became a symbol of the war on drugs, his face plastered across wanted posters, his reputation demonized in speeches. For Washington, capturing him would be more than an arrest. It would be a victory, a trophy, proof that even the boldest trafficker could be brought down. Inside Colombia, the government faced its own dilemma. Corruption ran deep, but U.S. pressure ran deeper. Leaders knew that harboring men like Lehder risked international isolation. But moving against him meant risking cartel retaliation, a wave of assassinations and bombings. The country itself was caught in the crossfire, torn between foreign demands and domestic terror. And through it all, Lehder clung to his identity. He still ranted about politics, about revolution, about cocaine as Colombia's salvation. He still called himself a visionary, a fighter against imperialism. But the words rang hollow. His movement had collapsed. His island had fallen. His fortress was gone. Now, he was just another man on the run, hunted by governments, distrusted by allies, consumed by paranoia. The underground years eroded him. His body grew thinner, his eyes more frantic, his temper sharper. Friends became strangers, strangers became enemies. He lashed out, fired men, punished suspected traitors, demanded loyalty with bullets instead of charisma. The flamboyant king of Norman's Cay was gone. What remained was a fugitive, cornered and unraveling. The chapter closes with an image heavy with irony. Lehder, once the architect of an empire, sitting in a dim safe house in Medellin, curtains drawn, a pistol on the table, cocaine scattered beside it. Outside, the city hums with life, cars, children, vendors, but inside, he is trapped in silence, his world shrinking. In Miami, his product still flows. In Washington, his name still echoes. But here, in the shadows, he is just a man waiting for the inevitable. The crowd outside Bogotá's Palace of Justice was silent, staring at the smoking ruins of what had once been a seat of law. Judges, clerks, staff, their bodies carried out under white sheets, the air heavy with ash and grief. Days earlier, gunmen had stormed the building, bullets and fire tearing through marble halls. They claimed to be revolutionaries, but the whispers told another story. Behind the attack was the shadow of the cartels. It was not just a building under siege. It was justice itself. By the mid-1980s, Colombia was trapped in a storm that seemed impossible to escape. On one side, the Medellin cartel and its allies, armed, wealthy, ruthless. On the other, a government pressure by Washington, pushed to act against traffickers who seemed larger than life. The battlefield was not just jungles and streets. It was courthouses, Congress halls, even the very Constitution of Colombia. And at the heart of the conflict was one word that struck terror into every trafficker's heart: extradition. To most people, extradition sounded simple, a legal agreement between nations to hand over criminals. But to men like Lehder, Escobar, and the rest of the cartel, it was a death sentence in disguise. Colombian prisons could be bribed, bought, manipulated. But American prisons? Those were iron cages, impossible to escape. To be extradited north was to disappear forever, stripped of wealth, stripped of influence, stripped of the very power that made them untouchable. For the cartel, extradition was worse than death. The United States knew this, and they used it like a blade. Treaties were signed, agreements made, lists drawn up. Washington wanted the traffickers not just arrested, but flown to Miami, New York, or Washington itself, paraded as proof of victory in the war on drugs. Every headline, every capture, would be political currency. And so, the pressure mounted. Colombia had to choose: bow to Washington's demands, or resist and face international isolation. The traffickers chose war. Threats began with whispers, then with bullets. Judges who spoke in favor of extradition were targeted. Some received death threats. Others found bombs under their cars. Many never made a home. In Bogotá, magistrates worked behind locked doors, knowing any ruling against the cartel could be their last. One by one, the protectors of law fell, not in courtrooms, but in the streets, murdered for doing their jobs. It was not just intimidation. It was policy, deliberate and merciless. The cartel called it silver or lead. Accept their bribes, take their silver, and live. Refuse, stand for justice, and face their lead. For many officials, the choice was survival. Families were threatened, children followed to school, wives warned in hushed phone calls. Some bent, others stood firm and paid with their lives. Colombia bled not only in its barrios, but in its institutions. For Carlos Lehder, the escalation was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had always despised the idea of extradition, calling it a violation of sovereignty, a tool of imperialism. In his fiery speeches, he ranted that Colombia should never hand over its citizens to foreign courts. But beneath the slogans was fear. He knew if captured, the Americans wanted him badly. He would not be allowed to fade into obscurity in a Colombian jail. He would be caged in the north, a trophy for the war on drugs. Escobar, too, understood the stakes. And unlike Lehder, Escobar had the discipline to turn fear into strategy. He organized assassinations, funded attacks, coordinated propaganda. Billboards appeared in Medellin, declaring, "We prefer a grave in Colombia to a cell in the United States." It was more than a slogan. It was a promise. The cartel would fight extradition with everything they had: guns, bombs, money, blood. The government wavered. Some leaders pushed forward, determined to honor treaties, to show the world that Colombia would not bow to terror. Others hesitated, fearing the backlash, fearing the violence already consuming their streets. The country was divided, its leaders caught between the wrath of traffickers and the demands of Washington. And all the while, the assassinations continued. Journalists who investigated cartel finances, politicians who spoke against corruption, police officers who dared to raid stash houses. No one was safe. The violence became a drumbeat, constant, relentless. Colombia was not just fighting traffickers. It was fighting for its soul. For Lehder, the chaos deepened his paranoia. Safe houses felt less safe. Allies felt less loyal. He shifted constantly, never staying too long in one place, convinced betrayal lurked around every corner. His speeches grew more manic, his cocaine use more destructive, his rants more desperate. He spoke of revolution, of independence, of a Colombia free from American chains. But those around him knew the truth. Beneath the bravado, he was terrified. Extradition haunted him like a ghost, whispering that time was running out. Escobar, meanwhile, thrived in the storm. He became both feared and worshipped, a man who built schools by day and ordered assassinations by night. His control of Medellin tightened. His war against extradition became a national crisis. But even he knew the tide could not be held back forever. The Americans were relentless, and the Colombian state, no matter how corrupt, could not ignore the blood forever. The question was not if the cartel would be challenged. It was when. The streets of Bogotá became war zones. Car bombs exploded outside government buildings. Judges were gunned down in traffic. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear of stray bullets. And through it all, the question of extradition hung like a sword over every conversation. Could the state deliver its most powerful criminals to the United States? Or would the cartels bring the entire country to its knees before letting that happen? The chapter closes with a haunting image. A Colombian judge, tired and pale, leaving his office under the shadow of armed guards. He knows his name is on a list. He knows the cartel has promised to silence him. And still, he signs the papers. Still he upholds the law, even as his fate is sealed. Across town, in a dim safe house, Carlos Lehder paces, ranting about freedom, but glancing nervously at the door with every sound. In Washington, officials draft cables demanding action, pointing to names like his. Three worlds, colliding in blood and fear. And in that collision, one truth is certain. The storm of extradition is only beginning. The knock came just before dawn. Sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that turns the stomach to stone. Inside the safe house, Carlos Lehder froze. For years, he had lived like this, shifting between hideouts, sleeping with a pistol within reach, jolting awake at every creak in the night. But this knock felt different. It was the sound of inevitability catching up, the moment every fugitive fears. The empire was gone. The island was gone. And now, so was the illusion of safety. Lehder's capture did not happen overnight. It was the slow tightening of a noose, pulled by allies, enemies, and governments alike. For months, whispers spread through Medellin. Lehder had become a liability. His paranoia had alienated old partners. His rant about politics had become dangerous noise. His usefulness had evaporated with the fall of Norman's Cay. Escobar tolerated him less and less, the cartel relying on quieter, more disciplined operators. Lehder's time had passed, and in the underworld, when time passes, betrayal is never far behind. The betrayal came from within. Someone in his circle, a man he trusted, a man who had shared meals, jokes, and late-night strategy sessions, gave up his location. Whether for money, survival, or both, the result was the same. The Americans had been demanding his head for years. The Colombian government, bleeding from cartel violence, saw an opportunity. And so, the hunters moved. On the morning of February 4th, 1987, Colombian forces surrounded Lehder's safe house in the small city of Medellin. Soldiers in green fatigues moved with rifles ready, cutting off every exit. Neighbors peered through shutters, too afraid to breathe too loudly, knowing what it meant when the army arrived before sunrise. Inside, Lehder scrambled. He had weapons, bodyguards, and bravado, but he also knew the truth. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, out of time. The arrest was quick, almost anticlimactic. Guards either fled or froze. Lehder was dragged from his hideout, disheveled, furious, still shouting of revolution, even as soldiers bound his wrists. He raged that he was being sold out, that Colombia was surrendering to American imperialism. But his words, once amplified by microphones and money, now fell flat in the morning air. He was no longer the flamboyant king of Norman's Cay. He was a prisoner, captured like any other fugitive. News spread instantly. Across Colombia, people whispered that the Americans had finally won a trophy. In Miami, headlines celebrated. For U.S. officials, the arrest was more than justice. It was vindication, proof that no trafficker was beyond reach. The man who once mocked the United States on television, who boasted of his fortress in the Bahamas, was now in chains, waiting for the very fate he had feared most, extradition. But even in defeat, Lehder clung to his narrative. As he was led through the streets, he shouted about sovereignty, about betrayal, about dying in Colombia rather than rotting in an American cell. Yet the irony was inescapable. His capture was the direct result of betrayal, not by governments, but by those he trusted most. The cartel, his supposed brothers in arms, had fed him to the wolves to protect themselves. In the end, the man who had built his empire on loyalty and paranoia fell victim to the very thing he feared most. For Colombia, the arrest was a political gamble. Delivering Lehder to the United States meant obeying Washington's pressure, but it also meant painting a target on the backs of officials who allowed it. Judges, ministers, soldiers, all knew the cartel would respond with fury. Extradition was more than law. It was a declaration of war. And with Lehder's capture, that war escalated. The logistics of his handover were shrouded in secrecy. Armed convoys transported him between prisons. Helicopters hovered overhead. Roads were blocked. Every movement was guarded, every detail hidden, for fear the cartel would stage a rescue or unleash an attack. In a country where car bombs had become common, no one felt safe. Every official involved in his case knew they were signing their own death warrant. Yet the process continued, slow but steady, toward the inevitable. And then, the moment came. Lehder was flown out of Colombia under heavy guard, shackled inside a military plane, bound not just by chains but by history. As the engines roared and the ground fell away, he stared into the clouds, raging, cursing, perhaps realizing that his world had ended. For a man who once controlled islands, airstrips, and empires, he was now just another body in a seat, powerless against the machinery of states. When he landed in Florida, the victory was paraded like a spectacle. American officials held press conferences, cameras flashed, and headlines screamed that one of the biggest drug lords in history was finally in U.S. custody. For them, Lehder was more than a prisoner. He was a symbol, proof that the war on drugs had teeth. In courtrooms and newspapers, his capture became a warning to others. The United States would never stop hunting. But symbols are double-edged. To the Medellin cartel, Lehder's extradition was confirmation of their worst fears. If he could be handed over, so could they. Escobar and his lieutenants saw the writing on the wall. They doubled down on violence. Unleashing a wave of terror meant to make extradition impossible. Judges were killed, politicians assassinated, planes bombed from the sky. Colombia became a battlefield. The cartel determined to stop more of its men from sharing Lehder's fate. For Carlos, the reality of his betrayal gnawed at him. Locked in a foreign cell, far from the jungles and islands where he once ruled, he replayed the events in his mind. Who had betrayed him? Was it a guard, a partner, a friend? Did Escobar himself order it? In the silence of prison, the questions circled endlessly, each answer darker than the last. He had built his empire on ambition and paranoia, but in the end, it was not enough. No amount of cocaine, money, or bravado could save him from the simple truth. He had been left behind. The chapter closes with a powerful image. Lehder, shackled and defiant, standing before an American judge, his voice echoing in a courtroom that cared nothing for his speeches or his politics. Across the ocean, in Colombia, explosions rock the streets, assassins stalk officials, and the cartel wages war against the very concept of extradition. The lines are drawn, the blood is flowing, and the fate of Colombia itself hangs in the balance. And in the middle of it all, Carlos Lehder, the man who once turned a Bahamian island into a cocaine fortress, now sits in a foreign cage, betrayed by his own, facing a future he spent his life trying to avoid. The courtroom was buzzing with a kind of electricity rarely felt in halls of justice. Reporters crammed into the benches, notebooks open, cameras flashing outside the doors. Prosecutors shuffled thick binders stuffed with evidence, photographs, flight logs, financial trails. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, knowing they were not just deciding the fate of one man, but witnessing a global war play out in miniature. At the center of it all sat Carlos Lehder, shackled, defiant, his once flamboyant presence now confined to a defendant's chair. He looked out at the courtroom with a strange mix of arrogance and disbelief, as though the world had made a mistake and would soon realize it. The trial was not just about cocaine. It was about power, defiance, and spectacle. The United States wanted to send a message. After years of drug wars spilling into Miami, after billions in cocaine profits had fueled chaos in their cities, they finally had one of the architects of the storm in their custody. Lehder was not just a trafficker. He was a symbol, the man who turned an island into a fortress, who mocked American officials, who flaunted his wealth and his vision. Now, that same man would be paraded in front of the world, stripped of his myth. From the start, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors laid out shipment after shipment, ton after ton of cocaine ferried across Norman's Cay, flown into Florida, hidden in cars and warehouses. They produced witnesses, pilots, associates, even former allies, who described in chilling detail the operations Lehder had masterminded. Maps were displayed, showing the airbridge he had built, the routes that had carried poison into American streets. Financial records revealed the staggering profits, millions washing through banks, shell companies, and cash-stuffed suitcases. But the trial was more than numbers and logistics. It was theater. Lehder himself made sure of that. He interrupted proceedings, launched into rants about American imperialism, accused the government of hypocrisy. He claimed he was not a criminal, but a revolutionary, a man standing up for Colombia against a foreign oppressor. To the jurors, the speeches sounded unhinged. To the prosecutors, they were a gift, proof of his arrogance. But to Lehder, it was his last stage. If he could not rule from an island, he would at least rage from a courtroom. The revelations shocked even those hardened by years of drug war headlines. Witnesses described Norman's Cay in lurid detail, the airstrip guarded by armed men, the villas stuffed with cash. The parties were champagne mixed with cocaine, and pilots took off into the night with tons of powder. Jurors heard how shipments flooded Miami, how violence erupted as cartels fought for territory, how money laundering corrupted banks and businesses. The image of Lehder as a simple smuggler vanished. He was painted as a kingpin, a man who had reshaped the very culture of cocaine. Still, Lehder fought back. His lawyers argued that he was being made an example, that the government exaggerated his role, that others, including Escobar and the larger cartel, were far more powerful. They claimed Lehder was being sacrificed for headlines, a scapegoat to satisfy Washington's hunger for victory. In some ways, they were right. But the evidence was undeniable, and the jurors could not ignore the weight of it. The trial dragged on, week after week, each day another nail in the coffin of Lehder's myth. Prosecutors spoke of lives destroyed by cocaine, of families broken by addiction, of neighborhoods consumed by violence. They pointed directly to Lehder, calling him a merchant of death. The words hit hard. For years, Lehder had styled himself as a revolutionary, a visionary. But in this courtroom, he was reduced to something simpler, a dealer of misery. As the trial neared its end, the tension grew unbearable. Jurors avoided the defendant's eyes, aware of the danger of their decision. Outside, security was tightened. U.S. Marshals patrolled the halls. Helicopters hovered nearby, every corner of the courthouse guarded. Fear of cartel retaliation hung over everything, like a shadow no one could shake. Some whispered that Escobar himself might strike, that the trial could end in blood. But the days passed, and the verdict approached. When it finally came, the courtroom fell silent. The jurors filed in, their faces pale, their voices steady. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Charge after charge read aloud. Drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy. Lehder sat still, his face unreadable. Perhaps he expected it. Perhaps he refused to believe it. But when the judge pronounced the sentence, life plus 135 years, the weight of it settled like stone. The flamboyant king of Norman's Cay, the man who had dreamed of revolution, would now rot in a cell until his death. For the United States, it was a triumph. Officials hailed the conviction as proof that the war on drugs could be won, that even the boldest traffickers could be brought to justice. Newspapers splashed the headlines. Anchors on television spoke of a new era. But behind the celebration lurked reality. Cocaine still flowed. Cartel violence still raged. Lehder's conviction was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder that cutting off one head did not kill the beast. For Lehder, the trial marked the end of his myth. He had entered the courtroom defiant, spouting speeches and promises of revolution. He left it condemned, his voice silenced by walls and bars. Yet, even in defeat, he clung to the belief that history would remember him differently. He claimed he had fought for sovereignty, that his cause was just. But in the eyes of the world, the verdict was clear. He was not a hero. He was a trafficker, guilty beyond doubt. The chapter closes with a haunting image. Lehder, shackled once more, led from the courtroom surrounded by guards, the sound of cameras flashing like gunfire in the distance. Outside, reporters shouted questions, their voices drowned by the roar of helicopters overhead. In Miami, cocaine still hit the streets. In Medellin, Escobar still reigned. And in a U.S. prison, one man who once believed he was untouchable now faced the rest of his life in a cage. But prison walls do not silence ambition. And as Lehder settled into his new reality, another question lingered. How long could even a life sentence contain a man who once built an empire from nothing? The clang of the prison gate echoed like a final verdict. For Carlos Lehder, it was the sound of his empire collapsing into concrete and steel. He had once ruled a Bahamian island, commanded fleets of planes, mingled with cartel royalty. Now, he was just another inmate, stripped of his tailored suits and flamboyant speeches, dressed in government-issued beige. Life plus 135 years. The sentence was not just a punishment. It was an erasure, a reminder that his dreams of revolution and glory had ended in a cage. But even behind bars, Lehder refused to disappear quietly. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he was still a historical figure, not just a prisoner. In the cafeteria line, in the yard, in whispered conversations with other inmates, he spun stories of Norman's Cay, of Escobar, of the cocaine empire that once terrified governments. Some listened in awe, others in disbelief, but all knew one thing. This man was not like the rest. He was infamous, and even within prison walls, infamy carries weight. At first, his notoriety gave him a kind of shield. Inmates respected him. Guards watched him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. But notoriety is a double-edged blade. It draws attention. It makes enemies. Lehder found himself both admired and isolated, a figure who could never fade into the anonymity that prison life demands. Every guard knew his name. Every report mentioned his past. For a man who once thrived on the spotlight, it was both a comfort and a curse. His sentence, life plus 135 years, was designed to send a message. The extra years, stacked like bricks on top of eternity, were symbolic, a way of saying he would never walk free. But Lehder never stopped looking for cracks in the wall. He filed appeals, demanded retrials, argued about his rights. Each attempt failed, yet each kept his name alive in headlines, a reminder that he had not surrendered. To him, every legal motion was another act of defiance. Inside, time moved differently. Days bled into nights, weeks into years. For a man used to the chaos of smuggling runs and the adrenaline of evasion, prison was torture in slow motion. The monotony broke him in ways violence never could. No roaring engines, no lavish parties, no speeches to adoring crowds. Only the scrape of shoes in corridors, the slam of cell doors, the distant echo of radios. The silence was deafening. Yet even there, Lehder found ways to stir chaos. He wrote letters, gave interviews through intermediaries, kept his story alive in the outside world. Journalists sought him out, eager for quotes from a man who had once stood beside Escobar. Activists debated his case, pointing to corruption in Colombia, to the dangers of extradition. Lehder leaned into it, painting himself as a political prisoner, a revolutionary betrayed by governments. It was the same narrative he had clung to for years, only now his stage was smaller, his audience thinner. But the truth beneath the speeches was harder. Lehder struggled. He battled illness, depression, the weight of time. His body grew weaker, his fire dimmer. The cocaine that had fueled his manic energy was gone, leaving behind exhaustion and regret. Fellow inmates noticed a shift. The flamboyant kingpin who once bragged of islands and airstrips now paced his cell, thinner, quieter, shadows under his eyes. Even arrogance cannot mask decay forever. Still, prison could not erase the legend. For the public, Carlos Lehder remained the man who had turned a speck of sand in the Bahamas into the beating heart of the cocaine trade. Books, documentaries, and court transcripts kept his story alive. His name was whispered in the same breath as Escobar, Ochoa, and other giants of the Medellin cartel. He was both forgotten and remembered, invisible in prison, immortal in infamy. And even the U.S. government could not completely bury him. Behind the walls, Lehder became useful in unexpected ways. He offered information, hinted at cooperation, dangled secrets of the cartel. Rumors swirled that he struck deals, that his sentence might not be as ironclad as it seemed. Some said he betrayed old allies to reduce his time. Others insisted he exaggerated his knowledge to stay relevant. In the world of cartels, betrayal is currency. In prison, it is survival. Lehder's relationship with notoriety was complex. On one hand, he craved recognition, the validation of being seen as more than a criminal. On the other, fame made him a target. Guards watched for any sign of manipulation. Fellow inmates tested his toughness. Authorities feared his influence, moving him between facilities, isolating him when necessary. For every ounce of respect he earned, there was a pound of suspicion pressing back. As the years passed, Lehder became something almost mythical. To younger inmates, he was a story more than a man, a living relic of a time when traffickers ruled like kings. To journalists, he was a voice from history, the flamboyant outcast who had flown too close to the sun. To law enforcement, he was both trophy and reminder, proof of victory, but also proof of how massive the war on drugs had become. Yet behind the myth was still a man, one who had once dreamed of changing the world with cocaine, who had believed himself a revolutionary, only to end up staring at blank prison walls. Regret seeped through the cracks of his bravado. He spoke of betrayal, of corruption, of injustice, but rarely of the lives destroyed by his empire. Like many in his world, he excused his crimes with politics, dressing greed in the clothing of ideology. Whether he believed it himself or not, only he knew. The prison years marked the longest chapter of Lehder's life. Longer than his time at Norman's Cay, longer than his rise with Escobar, longer than his brief attempt at politics. Behind bars, the flamboyant kingpin was forced to live with silence, forced to confront the consequences he had always outrun. Yet even then, he clung to hope. Appeals continued. Negotiations surfaced. Rumors of transfers and deals circulated. In prison, hope is both poison and lifeline. The dream that tomorrow will bring freedom, the nightmare that it never does. And so the years stacked like bricks, each one heavier than the last. The man who once flew shipments worth millions now counted time in days and hours. The man who once mocked the United States now lived under its total control. The irony was sharp, almost cruel. For all his ambition, all his defiance, all his noise, Lehder had ended where he feared most, silent, powerless, forgotten by the very world he once tried to command. The chapter closes with an image both bleak and haunting. Lehder lying in his bunk, the light from a barred window falling across his face. Outside, the world moves on. New wars, new traffickers, new names replacing his in headlines. But inside, time stands still. The man who once built an empire from dust now has only dust for company. And yet, a question lingers. Is this truly the end of Carlos Lehder's story? Or does even prison have cracks where ambition can escape? The courtroom in Miami was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The man walking toward the witness stand was not a politician or a soldier. He was not a bureaucrat or a whistleblower. He was a convicted drug trafficker, sentenced to life plus 135 years. His name was Carlos Lehder. And on this day, he was not the defendant. He was the star witness, ready to testify against one of America's most notorious allies turned enemies, Manuel Noriega. For years, Lehder had rotted behind bars, his empire reduced to memory, his voice muffled by concrete walls. But prison has a way of reshaping ambition. And Lehder, ever the opportunist, saw a crack in the wall. Information, that was his new currency. Secrets he had once guarded now became bargaining chips. And he held plenty of them. Names, routes, bank accounts, conversations that connected traffickers not only to Colombia, but to Panama, to generals, even to presidents. In the game of survival, betrayal had become his only weapon. The U.S. government was eager to listen. By the late 1980s, Manuel Noriega, the strongman of Panama, had gone from being a useful partner to a dangerous liability. Once a paid informant for the CIA, Noriega had played both sides, helping American intelligence while also helping cartels move cocaine through Panama. Washington could no longer tolerate the double game. When Noriega was captured in operation, just cause and flown to the United States, the prosecutors needed more than military triumph. They needed testimony that could cut through the fog of politics and expose his role in the drug trade. That testimony came from Lehder. His appearance on the witness stand was surreal. Once, he had mocked the United States, boasting he would never fall into their hands. Now, shackled and gaunt, he leaned in a microphone, ready to deliver the very thing he once despised: cooperation. The irony was thick. The man who had turned Norman's Cay into a cocaine fortress, who had ranted about revolution, who swore he'd rather die in Colombia than rot in an American cell, now aligned himself with the very government he had declared his enemy. But Lehder was no fool. He understood the stakes. His sentence was crushing, his body weakening, his future non-existent. Testifying was not an act of repentance. It was survival. By helping the Americans, he could shave years from eternity, claw back some hope of freedom. And so he spoke. In painstaking detail, Lehder described how Noriega opened Panama as a safe passage for cocaine. He explained how planes landed, how money was laundered, how protection was bought. He told jurors of meetings where Noriega accepted bribes, where traffickers moved with impunity, where Panama became the toll booth for cocaine heading north. Every word he spoke carried weight, not just for the case, but for his own redemption. He was no longer a kingpin, no longer a fugitive. He was an informant, a collaborator, a man bargaining with truth. For prosecutors, his testimony was gold. For the defense, it was poison. They attacked him as unreliable, a criminal grasping at straws to save himself. They painted him as a liar, a manipulator, a man who would say anything for a reduced sentence. And they were not wrong. Lehder had every reason to embellish, to twist, to exaggerate. But jurors listened. And the spectacle of a cartel insider exposing a foreign leader was too powerful to ignore. The cooperation was a bitter pill for Lehder. In prison yards and among former allies, the word was treason. In the world of traffickers, there is no crime worse than betrayal. But Lehder had already been betrayed himself, handed over by his own. He rationalized that betrayal was simply the currency of survival, the same way money or cocaine had once been. If he had to sell his secrets to live, then so be it. The fallout was immense. Noriega was convicted, sentenced to decades behind bars in the very country that once protected him. Lehder's testimony played a role in that downfall, carving his name into history once again, not as a revolutionary or a kingpin, but as a witness against another fallen titan. It was a strange twist of fate. Two men who once moved in the same shadows now sat in the same chain of cages. Both toppled by the same machine they thought they could outmaneuver. For Lehder, cooperation did not erase his crimes, but it reshaped his future. His sentence was quietly reduced. The man once condemned to die behind bars now had a sliver of hope. Hope for release. Hope for a second life. The cost was high. His reputation shredded. His name cursed in the underworld. His legacy stained by betrayal. But Lehder had never been one to play by anyone's rules but his own. Survival, in the end, mattered more than loyalty. Behind closed doors, deals were struck. Testimony here, cooperation there, whispers of intelligence traded like cards. Lehder's usefulness made him relevant again, even as his body aged and his health declined. He was still a prisoner, but not just any prisoner. He was a tool, a witness, a reminder that even in defeat, power can be bartered. Yet cooperation is a dangerous road. It keeps a man alive, but it makes him a target. Even within the safety of U.S. prisons, Lehder knew he was hated by those who once called him brother. Traffickers have long memories, and betrayal is not easily forgiven. Every knock on his cell door, every unfamiliar face in the yard, carried a shadow of fear. He had escaped the chains of Colombia only to live with a new kind of prison, the prison of distrust. And through it all, Lehder remained himself. He spoke with bravado, spun his narrative as though history would absolve him. He claimed his cooperation was not betrayal but justice, that he was still a revolutionary at heart. Whether he believed it or simply needed to believe it, no one could say. What was clear was that the man who once dreamed of empires now dreamed only of freedom, one bargain at a time. The chapter closes with a chilling image. The courtroom empties after his testimony, reporters filing stories, prosecutors celebrating, defense attorneys cursing under their breath. Lehder sits alone in a holding cell, chains on his wrists, his eyes fixed on the floor. Outside, the world moves on, Noriega's fate sealed, Washington triumphant. But inside that cell, Lehder whispers to himself, perhaps wondering if his words bought him life, or only delayed the inevitable. The knock on the cell door came quietly, almost politely. But for Carlos Lehder, it carried the weight of a lifetime. For years, he had lived in the shadows of prison walls, his sentence written like a death warrant. Life plus 135 years. Yet now, whispers traveled faster than light through the corridors. The king of Norman's Cay, the flamboyant trafficker turned government witness, was about to step into a different kind of exile. Not freedom, not really, but something more dangerous, more uncertain. Witness protection. It did not happen overnight. The slow erosion of his sentence was carved out piece by piece, deal by deal, testimony by testimony. When he took the stand against Manuel Noriega, his words did not just help convict a dictator. They became currency, a trade in blood and secrets. In return, prosecutors lobbied for mercy. Judges reconsidered, and the life sentence that once stretched into eternity began to shrink, quietly, like ice melting under the sun. Lehder knew the bargain he had made. Cooperation came at a cost. In the cartel world, betrayal is the ultimate sin, and betrayers rarely survive. But his calculation was simple. Better to be hated and alive than loyal and forgotten in a cage. Still, he understood the risk. Walking out of prison did not mean safety. It meant becoming a target in a world where enemies live longer than friendships. The United States promised protection, but protection is a fragile word. It meant new identities, hidden addresses, the shadowy embrace of a program designed for mobsters and turncoats. For Lehder, it was surreal. He had once built a fortress in the Caribbean, guarded by men with rifles, shielded by bribes and fear. Now his safety depended on the same government he had mocked for years. The irony was suffocating. Inmates whispered as he was moved. Some spat curses, others stared in disbelief. The man who had once strutted across the cocaine frontier was now leaving not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a witness who cut deals to save himself. Even in departure, his presence divided the room. Respect from some, disgust from others, curiosity from all. Outside, the world had changed. The cocaine wars had shifted, new names replacing the old, new routes replacing Norman's Cay. Escobar was dead. The Medellin cartel was fractured. The drug trade had become global, more sophisticated, more fragmented. Lehder's once pivotal role now felt like a relic of another era. Yet to those who remembered, he was still infamous, still a symbol of how far ambition and arrogance could take a man before gravity pulled him down. Witness protection was not freedom. It was a cage without bars, an exile wrapped in anonymity. For Lehder, used to the roar of planes and the spotlight of cameras, it was a suffocating silence. No more parties, no more speeches, no more interviews where he thundered about revolution. Instead, there were small apartments, plain clothes, whispered instructions. Blend in. Keep quiet. Disappear. But Lehder was not built for silence. Even within protection, he found ways to keep his story alive. Letters leaked. Journalists hunted for him, piecing together rumors of where he might be. Some said he lived under a new name in the Midwest, quiet and invisible. Others whispered of him surfacing in courtrooms, his testimony still valuable for cases long after his empire crumbled. The truth was elusive, and perhaps that was the point. Protection thrives on uncertainty. If no one knows where you are, no one can kill you. Yet living like a ghost takes its toll. Lehder's health worsened. Years of cocaine abuse and prison strain, leaving scars no new identity could erase. His body grew frail, his energy dimmed. The flamboyant king who once boasted of immortality now battled illnesses in obscurity. He was alive, yes, but not the man he had been. Protection had preserved his body, but it had killed his myth. And still, the question lingered. Was it worth it? Was shaving decades off his sentence, securing survival, worth the eternal stain of betrayal? For Lehder, the answer changed depending on the day. Sometimes he spoke proudly of his cooperation, claiming he had helped expose corruption, that he had served justice in his own way. Other times, bitterness crept in, regret for the empire lost, the island seized, the revolution unrealized. In the solitude of witness protection, both versions of him lived side by side, the defiant visionary and the broken survivor. The United States had achieved what Colombia never could. They had silenced Carlos Lehder, not with bullets, not with bombs, but with bureaucracy and time. He became a ghost story told in narco history, his name whispered in documentaries, his face appearing in grainy photographs. Once, he had promised to reshape the world. Now, he was reshaped by it, hidden in plain sight, another file in the vast machinery of protection programs. Yet his story refused to fully die. Each time a journalist unearthed a clue, each time a documentary revisited Norman's Cay, Lehder's name surfaced again, like a body rising from deep water. He could not escape the legend he had built, even as he tried to survive its consequences. For every day he lived in obscurity, the myth of Carlos Lehder lived louder in the outside world. The chapter closes with a haunting question. Somewhere, under a different name, in a different place, Carlos Lehder sits in silence, the hum of ordinary life replacing the roar of engines and the echo of gunfire. He is alive, but invisible, protected, but hunted. A man who once built an empire from sand and ambition, now reduced to shadows. And in those shadows, one thought must linger, gnawing at him in the quiet of nights. Can a man who once ruled the skies ever truly learn to disappear? The airport was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place where no one expects history to unfold. A frail man stepped off the plane, his body stooped, his hair gray, his once fiery eyes dimmed by decades of prison walls and the heavy weight of survival. To most onlookers, he looked like any other aging traveler. Few recognized that this was Carlos Lehder, the flamboyant drug lord who had once turned a Bahamian island into a cocaine fortress, now arriving in Germany not as a kingpin, not as a fugitive, but as an exile. After more than 3 decades in U.S. custody, his release had come quietly, almost in secret. There were no headlines, no cameras flashing at the gates. For years, Lehder had been hidden within witness protection, his whereabouts unknown, his legend fading into whispers. But now, a deal had been struck, paperwork signed, arrangements made. He was free. Not free to return to Colombia, where too many enemies still remembered his betrayals. Not free to reclaim the spotlight he once craved. Instead, he was shipped into exile, to Germany, the land of his father, far from the jungles and islands that had defined his rise and fall. For a man who had once lived surrounded by guards, parties, and power, the transition was jarring. His new life was quiet, almost painfully ordinary. No armed patrols outside the door. No pilots waiting for his command. No cash-stuffed duffel bags piled in closets. Just a small apartment, plain furniture, the hum of a refrigerator, the silence of anonymity. It was a far cry from Norman's Cay, where he had strutted like a monarch across a private airstrip, his empire roaring through the Caribbean skies. But age had dulled his fire. Years in prison had broken his health, leaving him frail, often sick, his body a reminder of the price he had paid. Even the cocaine-fueled energy that once drove him into manic speeches and reckless gambles was gone. In its place was fatigue, the slow, heavy exhaustion of a man who had burned too brightly for too long. Neighbors in Germany described him as quiet, polite, a shadow of the man splashed across headlines in the 1980s. Yet beneath the quiet, the legend lingered. For those who knew his name, his presence in Germany was surreal. This was the same man who had stood beside Escobar, who had mocked the United States, who had once declared cocaine to be the engine of revolution. Now he walked through German streets unnoticed, just another old man carrying groceries. It was as if history itself had placed him in hiding, erasing his past with the anonymity of exile. For Lehder, exile was both blessing and curse. It gave him safety, protection from enemies who might still seek revenge, from governments that once hunted him relentlessly. But it also gave him invisibility, the one thing he had spent his life running from. Lehder had always craved attention, always needed to be seen, to be heard, to be larger than life. Now, his days passed in silence, his words spoken only to a handful of people, his story fading into obscurity. Still, there were moments when the past returned. Journalists tracked him down, digging for scraps of his story, eager to capture the man behind the myth. Sometimes he granted interviews, speaking of betrayal, of survival, of politics. He insisted he had never been just a trafficker, that his fight was always about sovereignty, about independence from U.S. control. But the fire in his words felt weaker, the conviction less sharp. Age and exile had taken their toll. The once flamboyant kingpin now sounded more like a man trying to convince himself of his own importance. Germany itself gave him little stage. He lived quietly, away from the chaos of Colombia, away from the drug wars that had claimed Escobar and countless others. In some ways, he was lucky. While others died in gunfights, car bombings, or prison riots, Lehder lived to old age, his story stretching across continents. But luck comes with irony. He had dreamed of being remembered as a revolutionary, yet he lived his final years as a recluse, remembered only by history books and documentaries. Neighbors saw only fragments of the man he once was. They saw the frailty, the long walks, the quiet routine. They did not see the airstrips, the parties, the betrayals. They did not hear the echoes of laughter from Norman's Cay, the roar of engines heading for Florida, the rants about politics and revolution. To them, he was simply an old man in exile. But to the world that remembered, he was a ghost, a reminder of how power can collapse, how legends can be reduced to silence. Lehder himself must have felt the weight of that contrast. Each morning, as he stepped into the streets of Germany, he carried not just groceries or medicine, but the burden of his past. The faces of men betrayed, the island he lost, the dreams that crumbled, the prison years that broke him. The irony of living in the homeland of his father, far from the soil of Colombia, must have stung in quiet moments. He had once declared himself untouchable, yet here he was, a man stripped of identity, forced to hide in plain sight. Yet even exile could not erase the myth. For students of history, for investigators of the cocaine wars, for those who trace the rise and fall of the Medellin cartel, Carlos Lehder remains an unforgettable chapter. The man who turned Norman's Cay into a fortress, the flamboyant trafficker who became a politician, the traitor who testified against Noriega, and finally, the exile who faded into Germany. His life became a parable of ambition, of arrogance, of survival at any cost. The chapter closes with a haunting scene. Somewhere in a small German town, Carlos Lehder sits by a window, the light falling across his lined face. Outside, children play, cars pass, life moves on. No one knows, or cares, that the man behind the glass once helped flood America with cocaine, that he once stood beside Escobar, that he once dreamed of revolution. He is alive, but invisible, present, but forgotten. And as he sits in that silence, one question hangs in the air. Does exile bring peace? Or is it simply another kind of prison, one without walls? The waves crash gently now, brushing against white sand that stretches out into turquoise water. Tourists walk barefoot along the shore, some unaware, some only vaguely curious about the history of this place. The air smells of salt and sunscreen, but if you listen closely, the silence carries an echo, the faint roar of small planes, the murmur of guards with rifles, the laughter from cocaine-fueled parties that once shook the night. This is Norman's Cay. Today, a tropical paradise. Yesterday, the beating heart of a drug empire. And its story has become legend. Long after the raids ended and the airstrip grew quiet, Norman's Cay refused to vanish from memory. It lived on in books, documentaries, whispered conversations in bars. Hollywood turned its shadow into spectacle, painting images of excess, danger, and ambition. For many, the island became a symbol, not just of the Medellin cartel, but of the entire cocaine cowboy era. A paradise lost to corruption, a jewel in the Caribbean Sea that became stained by blood and powder. For locals into the Bahamas, memory is more complicated. Some remember fear. Fishermen chased away by armed guards, whispers of planes landing at midnight, friends who disappeared after getting too close. Others remember the money that flowed in, the strange prosperity brought by outsiders with bottomless pockets. Norman's Cay was both a curse and a blessing, a ghost that still haunts the islands, even as tourism reclaims the beaches. In popular culture, the island transformed into something larger than life. Documentaries showcased its airstrips and villas. Journalists dug into its role as a cocaine highway, and movies spun its history into myth. For audiences who never set foot in the Bahamas, Norman's Cay became a stage, a place where power, greed, and arrogance collided. Each retelling added new layers, blurring the line between fact and folklore. And at the center of it all was Carlos Lehder. His name and Norman's Cay are forever entwined, like a monarch and his kingdom. Without him, the island would have been just another tropical paradise. With him, it became infamous, feared, and unforgettable. He turned sand and palm trees into an empire, an airstrip into a gateway, and a villa into a symbol of excess. The mythology of Norman's Cay is, in truth, the mythology of Lehder himself. But mythology has a way of softening edges, of painting over the fear and violence with intrigue and glamour. Visitors to the island today may hear tales of wild parties, champagne flowing like rivers, celebrities brushing shoulders with traffickers. They may picture the island as a playground, a fantasy. What gets lost in that romantic haze are the darker truths. The bodies buried in shallow graves, the locals terrorized into silence, the countless lives destroyed by the cocaine that launched from that runway. Norman's Cay is remembered as a legend, but its legacy is soaked in blood. Still, legends thrive because they are irresistible. For filmmakers and writers, Norman's Cay offers the perfect setting: a paradise corrupted, a kingdom built on secrecy, a fall as dramatic as its rise. Each retelling ensures the island's story endures, woven into the broader tapestry of the cocaine wars. Even decades later, its name sparks fascination. Tourists ask guides to point it out, journalists still chase the story, and historians mark it as a pivotal node in the global drug trade. For the Bahamas Island's legacy is complicated. On one hand, the government wants to promote its beaches, its beauty, its tourism potential. On the other, they cannot escape the shadow of its past. Norman's Cay will forever be linked to cocaine, to the Medellin cartel, to Lehder's arrogance. It stands as both a warning and a lesson. How easily paradise can be twisted by greed, how quickly beauty can become cover for corruption. And for Lehder himself, the island was his monument. Even in exile, even in old age, he spoke of Norman's Cay with pride, as though its infamy validated his place in history. He saw it not as a crime scene, but as a creation his vision brought to life. That perspective, warped by ego, ensured that Norman's Cay would remain central to his myth. To him, it was proof that he had mattered, that his ambition had carved his name into the world. The truth lies somewhere between myth and memory. Norman's Cay was never just a paradise, nor was it simply a fortress. It was both beauty and brutality stitched together. Its beaches tell one story, its ruins tell another, and its legacy forces us to confront a larger question. Why are we so fascinated by places like this? Why do we turn sites of violence into folklore, transform criminals into antiheroes, romanticize empires built on suffering? Perhaps because such stories reveal not just their hunger for power, but our hunger to understand it. Today, new investors talk of restoring Norman's Cay, building resorts, reclaiming it as a luxury destination. If they succeed, future visitors may swim in its waters, dine in its villas, never knowing what happened there. The past may be buried under layers of development, its history repackaged as a footnote for curious tourists. But legends are not so easily erased. The whispers will remain, carried in documentaries, in books, in conversations that begin with, "Did you know this island was once a drug empire?" The chapter closes with a striking image: a plane gliding over turquoise waters, landing gently on a pristine airstrip built for leisure, not smuggling. Tourists wave, their drinks in hand, as music drifts from a resort bar. Yet in the shadows of the palm trees, the ghosts remain. Guards with rifles, traffickers laughing, pilots loading powder into small planes, echoes of a past that refuses to die. And the question lingers: when paradise becomes myth, do we ever truly remember the horror, or do we only remember the legend? The name still sparks a reaction. Some hear it and think of fear. Others think of money. And for many, the name Carlos Lehder feels like the echo of a myth. A man who rose from obscurity, built an empire from sand and palm trees, and helped shape the cocaine boom that redefined America, Colombia, and the world. But memory is complicated. Was he a visionary, a criminal, a fool, or simply a product of his time? In truth, he was all of these things at once. The cocaine cowboy era has been replayed countless times in books, films, and documentaries. Miami in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a war zone. Bodies dumped in broad daylight, machine guns rattling outside nightclubs, skyscrapers being built with laundered cash. America had never seen anything like it, and the Medellin cartel was at its center. Lehder was not the most powerful of the cartel's leaders, nor the richest, nor the deadliest. Yet his influence was unique. He was the bridge, the architect of an airlift that funneled billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States. Without him, the pipeline would have been slower, riskier, perhaps even less devastating. He was, in a sense, a pioneer. But pioneers are remembered not only for their ingenuity, but for the destruction they leave behind. Lehder introduced efficiency, strategy, and vision to a trade that had once been small, chaotic, and limited. He saw Norman's Cay not just as an island, but as infrastructure, the same way a tech mogul might see a server farm or a shipping magnate might see a port. To him, cocaine was a commodity like oil, and the island was his refinery. That perspective, cold, calculated, brilliant in its own way, left a permanent mark on the global drug economy. But history remembers more than logistics. Lehder's flamboyance made him stand out. Where Escobar built hospitals and Gaviria plotted assassinations, Lehder preached politics. He wanted not just money, but recognition. He courted the media, made speeches about sovereignty, and even dreamed of creating a political movement. In that sense, he was unlike most traffickers. He wasn't content to hide in the shadows. He wanted the world to see him. And that hunger for visibility became both his weapon and his undoing. For the United States, Lehder was a turning point. His operations helped flood the country with cocaine, triggering a public health crisis that reshaped law enforcement, politics, and culture. The drug wars of the 1980s and 90s were, in part, responses to the chaos unleashed by men like him. Entire policies, from mandatory minimums to extradition treaties, bore the fingerprints of his legacy. In a twisted way, Lehder helped write the rulebook for the very war that eventually destroyed him. For Colombia, his memory is darker still. He is remembered as one of the many architects of a storm that tore the country apart. Judges assassinated, politicians threatened, entire communities consumed by violence. While Escobar's name dominates the headlines, Colombians have not forgotten that Lehder stood beside him in those early days, building the infrastructure that made the Medellin cartel a global force. To many, he was not just a trafficker, but a traitor, a man who brought ruin to his own homeland in pursuit of power and ego. And yet, paradoxically, Lehder is also remembered with fascination. His story fits neatly into the cultural obsession with outlaws, men who break rules, defy nations, and carve their names into history. Movies portray him as both villain and visionary. Documentaries dissect his madness and genius, and books immortalize his role in the cocaine boom. He is remembered not only as a criminal, but as a character, larger than life, impossible to ignore. But what of the personal legacy? Beyond the airstrips, the parties, the politics? For those who knew him, Lehder was a contradiction. He could be charismatic, persuasive, even charming. He could also be reckless, arrogant, and cruel. Friends became enemies. Allies became victims. His betrayals left scars that outlived his empire. In prison, his testimony against Noriega sealed his reputation as both survivor and traitor. Even in exile, his name carried the weight of mistrust. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is the myth of Norman's Cay. The island remains his monument, a reminder of what ambition can build and what arrogance can destroy. Every documentary that shows the airstrip, every film that depicts the paradise-turned fortress, keeps his name alive. It ensures that Carlos Lehder will always be remembered, not just as a trafficker, but as the man who turned an island into a cocaine hub. And yet, what does remembrance really mean? To the families shattered by addiction, he is remembered with anger. To historians, he is remembered as a case study, a symbol of how crime can reshape nations. To pop culture, he is remembered as entertainment, another outlaw in the long line of gangsters and cowboys. To himself, Perhaps he is remembered as a revolutionary, misunderstood, underestimated, larger than the sum of his crimes. Memory is never simple. It bends with perspective, shifts with time. For some, Lehder's name is a cautionary tale, proof of how greed corrupts, how power isolates, how arrogance destroys. For others, it is a source of morbid fascination, a story too dramatic to forget. And for those who lived through the cocaine wars, his legacy is not myth at all. It is scars, still visible decades later. The chapter closes on a haunting image. Somewhere, a documentary plays on a television screen, its narrator describing the rise and fall of Carlos Lehder. A young viewer, born long after the cocaine cowboy era, watches with wide eyes, drawn in by the spectacle. To them, Lehder is not real, not flesh and blood, not a man who once breathed and schemed and killed. To them, he is story, myth, shadow. And that may be his truest legacy, to live on not as a man, but as a memory, forever blurred between history and folklore. And the question remains, when we remember Carlos Lehder, are we remembering the man, or are we only remembering the legend he wanted us to see?